On the morning of June 22nd, 1944, at 6:47 a.m., Corporal Jack McVeigh crouched behind his Browning M2 heavy machine gun on a coral ridge overlooking the Japanese-held highlands of Saipan, watching enemy snipers move through tree cover 1,600 yards away, a distance his fellow Marines believed was completely safe from American small arms fire. At 26 years old, he was an Iowa farm boy turned heavy weapons specialist, with 0 confirmed long-range kills, facing an enemy that had 11 sniper teams hidden throughout the volcanic ridges. Snipers who had taken 19 Marine lives in just the past 48 hours from positions they thought were untouchable. His commanding officer had positioned the 84-pound M2 for area suppression, and the other platoon leaders assumed it would spray bursts at distant tree lines like every other machine gun in the Pacific. When McVeigh had first trained on the Browning back at Camp Pendleton, the instructor told him it was designed to stop trucks and planes, not pick off individual soldiers hiding in jungle canopy. The manual said effective range was 1,800 yards for vehicles, but everyone knew machine guns were for laying down covering fire in wide arcs, not precise shooting. His crew loaded belt after belt of 50 caliber rounds, each cartridge designed to punch through armor plating, while Japanese observers on distant ridges marked Marine positions through their scopes, believing themselves invisible at ranges where no rifle could reach them. They had held these same elevated bunkers for weeks, watching American forces advance below like insects, completely confident that 1,600 yards of jungle-covered terrain made them untouchable by anything smaller than artillery. The enemy snipers moved with casual arrogance, standing briefly in cave mouths, shifting between trees, even lighting cigarettes in broad daylight, because every military manual in the world said machine guns couldn't hit individual targets at that distance. Then McVeigh did something no one expected. He stopped firing in bursts and started aiming like a rifleman. The morning heat on Saipan felt like breathing through wet canvas, and Corporal Jack McVeigh wiped sweat from his eyes as he adjusted the traverse mechanism on his Browning M2. The machine gun sat mounted on its M3 tripod behind a wall of sandbags and coral chunks. Its barrel pointed toward the Ridgeal line 1,600 yards to the northwest, where Japanese snipers had been picking off Marines for 3 days straight. McVeigh had been manning this position since dawn, watching muzzle flashes wink from cave mouths and tree branches on the distant slope, knowing his crew was supposed to spray suppressive fire across the entire hillside whenever the enemy opened up. That was doctrine. That was what machine gunners did in the Pacific, lay down sheets of lead to keep enemy heads down while riflemen maneuvered. But McVeigh had been studying those flashes through his field glasses, and he was starting to think doctrine might be wrong. Sergeant Thomas Harding crawled up beside the gun emplacement, dragging a fresh belt of 50 caliber ammunition. "Still quiet over there," he muttered, settling into his position as assistant gunner. "Think they're sleeping in?" McVeigh kept his eye pressed to the optical sight they had jury-rigged to the gun's receiver. The sight was nothing fancy, a 4-power scope salvaged from a damaged sniper rifle, but it gave him a clear view of the Japanese positions. "They're moving. Third cave from the left about 10 minutes ago. Saw someone with a rifle." 1,600 yards, Hardin said, consulting the range card he had sketched on a piece of cardboard. Might as well be on the moon. The conventional wisdom said machine guns were area weapons. You pointed them at a general location and pulled the trigger until the barrel glowed red, hoping to suppress whatever was out there. The M2's manual listed its maximum effective range against point targets as 1,800 yards, but that was theoretical. Nobody actually tried to hit individual soldiers at that distance with a machine gun. Rifles were for precision. Machine guns were for volume. But McVeigh had grown up hunting deer on his father's farm in Iowa, and he understood something about ballistics that the training manuals didn't emphasize. The 50 caliber BMG cartridge left the barrel at 2,900 feet per second, faster than any rifle bullet he had ever fired. At 1,600 yards, it would drop about 8 feet and take roughly 1 3/4 seconds to reach the target. He had done the calculations on the back of a cigarette pack, working out wind drift and bullet drop the same way he had calculated shots on whitetails back home. The difference was whitetails didn't shoot back. A movement caught his attention through the scope. A Japanese soldier had emerged from the third cave carrying what looked like an Asaka rifle with a telescopic sight. The man moved casually, apparently confident that American small arms could not reach him across the valley. He settled into a firing position behind a fallen log, his rifle pointing down toward the Marine perimeter. McVeigh felt his pulse quicken. This was the sniper who had killed Corporal Rodriguez 2 days ago and Private Johnson yesterday morning. The same patient, methodical shooter who appeared at irregular intervals, fired 1 or 2 carefully aimed rounds, then vanished back into the caves. The enemy had been using the range advantage to terrorize the entire battalion, knowing Marine rifles could not answer back effectively. "Tom," McVeigh said quietly, "load me a belt with 1 tracer every 5th round." Hardin looked puzzled. "We doing suppressive fire?" "No, I'm going to try something." McVeigh adjusted the gun's elevation, cranking the mechanism to account for the bullet drop he had calculated. He set the traverse stops to limit his swing, creating a stable firing platform. The M2 weighed 84 pounds without the tripod, and the entire system was designed to absorb recoil from sustained automatic fire. But McVeigh was not planning to fire automatically. Through the scope, he could see the Japanese sniper adjusting his own rifle, preparing to engage targets in the Marine lines. The enemy soldier moved with the relaxed confidence of someone who believed himself completely safe. 1,600 yards was beyond the effective range of American rifles. It was beyond the range of most light machine guns. The Japanese manual probably said the same thing their manual said. Machine guns were area weapons, not precision instruments. McVeigh centered the crosshairs on the enemy sniper's chest, accounting for the wind that was drifting smoke from the morning cooking fires toward the east. He took a deep breath, let half of it out, and gently squeezed the trigger. The M2 fired once, a single sharp crack that echoed across the valley. Through the scope, McVeigh watched the tracer round arc through the humid air, its red streak cutting across the green jungle canopy. The bullet struck the fallen log 6 inches to the left of the Japanese sniper, sending up a shower of splintered wood. The enemy soldier froze, clearly stunned that a bullet had just passed close enough to feel the shockwave. He looked around frantically, apparently unable to comprehend how American fire had reached him at this distance. After several seconds of confusion, he scrambled backward into the cave mouth, abandoning his rifle position entirely. Harding stared at McVeigh with something approaching amazement. "Jesus, Mac, you almost got him." "Almost," McVeigh agreed, but he was already making mental adjustments. The shot had been close enough to prove the concept. The M2 could reach targets at ranges where the enemy felt safe. It was simply a matter of treating the machine gun like an enormous rifle instead of a traditional area weapon. Word of the shot spread through the Marine positions within an hour. Lieutenant Phillips crawled over from the adjacent platoon to see what his heavy weapons team was doing, bringing with him a pair of binoculars and a skeptical expression. "I heard you boys are trying to snipe with a .50 caliber. "Just testing the idea, sir," McVeigh replied. "Seems like it might work." Phillips studied the distant ridgeline through his binoculars. The Japanese positions that had been active all morning were now silent, their occupants apparently rattled by the realization that their sanctuary was not as secure as they had believed. "Range, 1,600 yards, sir. Maybe a bit more to the far caves." Phillips lowered his binoculars and looked at the M2 with new interest. Machine guns were not supposed to work this way. They were suppression weapons designed to force enemy troops to keep their heads down while friendly infantry maneuvered. But if a machine gun could actually hit individual targets at extended range, if it could turn the enemy safe zones into killing fields, then the entire tactical equation might change. As the sun climbed higher and the morning heat became oppressive, the Japanese ridge remained quiet. No muzzle flashes, no casual movement between positions. The enemy snipers who had terrorized the Marine battalion for days had gone to ground, suddenly aware that 1,600 yards was not the protective barrier they had assumed. That evening, as McVeigh cleaned the M2's barrel and Harding updated their range cards with more precise calculations, both men understood that something fundamental had shifted. They had not simply fired a machine gun at long range. They had redefined what a machine gun could do. By the 3rd day, McVeigh had transformed his machine gun imp placement into something resembling a sniper's nest, more than a traditional heavy weapons position. He and Hardin had constructed range cards for every visible landmark on the Japanese Ridgeal line, marking distances in 100-yard increments from 1,200 out to 800 yards. They had repositioned the M2 on its M3 tripod to provide maximum stability, using sandbags and coral chunks to create a solid firing platform that eliminated any tremor or movement that might throw off their aim at extreme range. The ballistics were challenging but manageable. The 50 caliber BMG round maintained a muzzle velocity of 2,900 feet per second, but at 1,600 yards, the bullet would drop approximately 8 feet below the line of sight and drift several feet laterally in even a modest crosswind. Beevor had worked out the calculations using time of flight, 1.7 seconds to target, and wind deflection tables that Hardin had copied from a field artillery manual. They mixed their ammunition belts with one tracer around every fourth cartridge, allowing Beevor to observe his shots and make rapid corrections. The Japanese had initially responded to the long-range fire by simply moving deeper into their cave positions, apparently believing the accurate shooting was either luck or the work of a hidden sniper team. But as Beevor continued to engage individual targets at distances that should have been impossible for machine gun fire, the enemy began to realize they were facing something unprecedented. Their movement patterns changed dramatically. Soldiers who had previously moved casually between positions now sprinted in short, panicked bursts. Observation posts that had been manned continuously were suddenly abandoned for hours at a time. Lieutenant Phillips visited the position daily now, bringing field glasses and occasionally calling in target designations from his infantry scouts. Cave mouth at 1,400 yards, bearing 075 degrees, he would announce, and Beevor would traverse the gun to the specified coordinates. The lieutenant had begun integrating the long-range machine gun fire into his tactical planning, using it to suppress specific enemy positions before infantry advances, rather than relying solely on artillery support. The logistical implications were significant. Traditional machine gun employment consumed ammunition at rates of 400 to 600 rounds per minute during sustained fire missions, but precision shooting required a completely different approach. Beevor was firing single shots or short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, taking time to aim and adjust between engagements. A typical day's shooting might consume only 2 or 3 50-round belts instead of dozens, but each round had to count. The crew found themselves spending more time on maintenance and preparation than actual firing, cleaning the barrel obsessively, checking the scope mounting, ensuring the tripod remained perfectly stable. Hardin had become expert at reading wind conditions and estimating range to unmarked targets. He could glance at smoke, drift, and vegetation movement and provide windage corrections accurate enough for Beevor to hit targets on the first or second shot. The partnership was evolving into something more sophisticated than traditional machine gun crew dynamics. They were functioning more like a precision rifle team, with Harding serving as spotter and Beevor as shooter. The psychological impact on the Japanese defenders was becoming evident. Through binoculars, the Marines could observe increased bunker construction and camouflage efforts on the enemy ridgeline. Japanese soldiers were spending more time underground and less time manning observation posts. Several previously active sniper positions had gone completely silent, their occupants apparently unwilling to risk exposure at ranges they had once considered secure. On the morning of June 26th, Beevor achieved what he later described as his most satisfying engagement of the campaign. A Japanese machine gun team had set up a Type 999 light machine gun behind a rocky outcrop at approximately 1,700 yards, thinking themselves well beyond the reach of American small arms. The position commanded excellent fields of fire down into the Marine assembly areas, and the enemy gunners had been harassing supply parties and communication runs all week. Beevor spent 20 minutes studying the target through his scope, waiting for the Japanese crew to become careless enough to expose themselves. The machine gun was positioned behind natural cover, but the gunner had to lean slightly to the left to aim down the slope toward American positions. It was a small target, perhaps 18 inches of exposed torso, but it was predictable. When the Japanese gunner leaned into his firing position, Beevor was ready. He had already adjusted for range and wind, and his crosshairs were centered on the exact spot where the enemy soldier's body would appear. The 50 caliber round struck the Japanese gunner in the upper chest. The massive bullet's kinetic energy sufficient to kill instantly at that range. The enemy machine gun position went silent immediately, and remained so for the rest of the day. The engagement was witnessed by an entire rifle platoon that had been pinned down by the Japanese machine gun, and word of the shot spread throughout the battalion within hours. Marines who had been skeptical of the long-range machine gun concept became believers. Requests began coming in from other units for similar fire support, and several heavy weapons crews started experimenting with precision shooting techniques using their own M2 positions. But success brought new challenges. The Japanese, recognizing the threat posed by the long-range machine gun fire, began targeting McVer's position with mortar rounds and sniper fire of their own. Enemy observers had identified the general location of the troublesome American gun, even if they could not pinpoint it exactly, and they began dropping mortar shells in the vicinity. Throughout the day, the crew was forced to construct overhead protection and plan alternate firing positions in case their primary imp placement was compromised. More significantly, the ammunition supply situation was becoming strained. While McVer's precision shooting consumed fewer rounds per day than traditional machine gun employment, the demand for 50 caliber ammunition was increasing as other crews adopted similar techniques. The battalion supply officer warned that current consumption rates were exceeding the planned logistical footprint for heavy machine gun operations, and resupply from the beach was complicated by ongoing Japanese artillery fire on the landing zones. The tactical situation was also evolving. As the Marine advance pushed closer to the Japanese Regial lines, the optimum firing positions for long-range precision work were becoming less available. The crew found themselves having to displace their heavy equipment more frequently, losing the stable, prepared positions that made accurate shooting possible. What had worked perfectly for static defensive operations was proving more difficult to sustain during active offensive movements. By the end of June, McVer had confirmed kills on 7 individual Japanese soldiers at ranges between 1,300 and 1,700 yards, with several additional probable kills where bodies could not be observed. The psychological impact was far greater than the actual casualty count suggested. An entire enemy battalion had modified its tactical behavior because of one machine gun crew that refused to accept conventional limitations on what their weapon could accomplish. The Japanese response came on July 2nd in the form of coordinated counter-sniper fire that forced McVer to completely rethink his tactical approach. At 0630 hours, as he settled behind his M2 to begin the day's observation of enemy positions, a bullet cracked past his head and buried itself in the sandbags 2 in from his right shoulder. The shot had come from a concealed position approximately 1,400 yards to the northwest, well within the effective range of a skilled marksman with a scoped Arisaka Type 99. Hardin dropped flat beside the gun imp placement as a second bullet struck the coral parapet directly in front of their position. "They've got us ranged," he said, crawling backward toward the communication trench. "That's not random fire." McVer slid away from the machine gun, keeping his head below the sandbag line. The Japanese had clearly identified his position and assigned at least one sniper team to neutralize the troublesome American gun crew. It was an entirely predictable response, and one that McVer realized he should have anticipated. By maintaining a fixed firing position for over a week, he had given the enemy ample opportunity to study his location and plan countermeasures. The immediate problem was tactical. McVer's crew had spent days perfecting their range cards and sight settings for this specific position. Moving the 84-pound M2 and its tripod to an alternate location would require at least an hour of setup time to re-establish accurate firing data, during which the Japanese positions would be free to operate without harassment. But staying in place meant accepting continued sniper fire that would eventually find its mark. Lieutenant Phillips crawled into the position 30 minutes later, bringing reports from his forward observers. "They've got at least 2 sniper teams working your area," he informed McVer. "One firing from that ridge complex to the northwest, another one somewhere in the tree line to the northeast, probably Type 99s with scopes, maybe 4 power optics." The tactical situation had fundamentally changed. For the first week of operations, McVer had enjoyed the luxury of engaging targets that could not effectively return fire. The Japanese had been armed with weapons that could not reach his position, giving him a decisive advantage in any exchange. But now the enemy had responded by deploying their own long-range precision shooters, turning the engagement into a genuine sniper duel, where both sides possess lethal capability. McVeer and Hardin spent the morning constructing a decoy position 50 yards to the east of their actual firing point, using spare sandbags, camouflage netting, and a damaged M2 barrel. They created a convincing duplicate of their machine gun imp placement, complete with a helmet position to simulate a gunner's head. The construction work had to be done during periods when Japanese observation was limited, crawling on hands and knees to avoid skylining themselves against the ridge. The real M2 was relocated to a depression in the coral reef that provided natural protection from the northwest, but maintained clear fields of fire toward the primary target areas. The new position required completely recalculating range data and wind corrections, and the available space was more cramped than their original imp placement, but it offered the crucial advantage of being unexpected. The Japanese snipers would be aiming at coordinates that no longer contained American personnel. The psychological dimension of the engagement was becoming as important as the tactical aspects. McVeer found himself constantly scanning the enemy ridgeline for muzzle flashes or scope glints that might reveal sniper positions while simultaneously trying to identify targets for his own fire. The relaxed, methodical shooting of the previous week was replaced by a tense game of hunter and hunted, where a moment's carelessness could prove fatal. On July 4th, the decoy position proved its worth. At approximately 10-15 hours, a Japanese sniper fired 3 rapid shots at the dummy emplacement, the bullets striking sandbags and camouflage netting with audible impacts. McVeer was able to locate the muzzle flash through his scope, a position in a cluster of boulders roughly 1,500 yards to the northwest, and returned fire with a single carefully aimed round. The shot struck within inches of the target, sending up a spray of rock fragments that forced the enemy sniper to abandon his position. But the engagement revealed a fundamental problem with the precision machine gun concept. Traditional machine gun crews could suppress enemy fire through volume and area coverage, forcing opposing forces to keep their heads down regardless of whether individual shots found their marks. McVeer's precision approach required him to expose his position for extended periods, while aiming and adjusting fire, making him vulnerable to counter-sniper operations. The very accuracy that made his shooting effective also made him a priority target for enemy marksmen. The ammunition supply situation was becoming critical as well. The battalion had exhausted its initial allocation of 50 caliber rounds, and resupply from the beach was irregular due to Japanese artillery fire on the landing zones. McVeer's crew was limited to 2 belts per day, 100 rounds, which barely allowed for the careful sighting and adjustment shots that precision work required. Traditional machine gun tactics could be sustained with abundant ammunition, but the precision approach demanded both accuracy and conservation. Hardin developed an innovative solution to the observation problem by coordinating with Marine artillery spotters who were already positioned in forward observation posts with excellent views of the Japanese positions. The artillery observers could designate targets and provide real-time assessment of shot placement without requiring McVeer to expose himself for extended observation periods. The system worked effectively, but it added another layer of complexity to what had begun as a simple shooting problem. On July 6th, McVeer achieved what would later be recorded as his longest confirmed kill of the campaign. A Japanese machine gun team had positioned a Type 99 light machine gun in a cave mouth at an estimated 1850 yard, just at the extreme range of the M2's effective capability. The target was barely visible even through the jury-rigged telescope, appearing as little more than a shadow in the cave opening. The shot required precise calculation of bullet drop nearly 12 feet at that range, and careful estimation of wind conditions that could drift the heavy bullet several feet laterally during its 2.1-second flight time. McVeer spent 15 minutes studying the target through his scope, waiting for the Japanese gunner to position himself consistently enough to provide a predictable aiming point. When the shot came, the 50 caliber round struck the cave wall directly beside the enemy machine gun position, the impact close enough to wound or kill the gunner through flying rock fragments. The Japanese weapon went silent immediately and remained inactive for the remainder of the day. Artillery observers confirmed through binoculars that the position had been abandoned, with equipment visible scattered around the cave entrance. The engagement represented both the peak achievement and the practical limit of the precision machine gun concept. 1850 yards was approaching the maximum effective range of the M2 against point targets. and the shot had required perfect conditions and considerable luck to succeed. Beyond that range, the limitations of the improvised scope, the difficulty of reading wind conditions, and the natural dispersion of the ammunition made consistent accuracy impossible. By evening, McVeigh understood that the tactical situation was shifting again. The Japanese were learning to counter his precision fire through improved camouflage, irregular movement patterns, and aggressive counter-sniper operations. What had begun as an overwhelming American advantage was evolving into a more complex engagement where both sides possessed lethal long-range capability, and success depended as much on fieldcraft and patience as on marksmanship skill. The crisis began at dawn on July 8th when the ammunition resupply failed to arrive for the second consecutive day. McVeigh counted his remaining 50 caliber rounds and realized he had exactly 43 cartridges left, less than one complete belt for his M2. The landing ships that normally brought ammunition to the beach had been delayed by a coordinated kamikaze attack on the naval support group, and the battalion supply officer could provide no estimate for when the next resupply would reach the island. Harding crouched beside the machine gun imp placement, studying their improvised range cards with growing concern. At our current rate, we've got maybe 6 engagements left, he calculated. After that, we're down to what the riflemen can reach. The tactical implications were severe. Over the past week, the precision machine gun fire had suppressed Japanese activity across nearly 2 miles of enemy-held ridgeline line. Sniper positions that had terrorized Marine infantry were now abandoned or minimally manned. Observation posts that had directed mortar fire on American supply routes had gone silent. The psychological impact on enemy forces was evident in their increasingly cautious movement patterns and reduced operational tempo. But all of that advantage would disappear once the M2 fell silent. Lieutenant Phillips arrived at the position shortly after sunrise, bringing reports from his forward observers that painted an increasingly grim picture. Intelligence says the Japanese are massing for a counterattack, he informed McVeigh. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow morning. They're moving troops through those ridges you've been watching, probably figuring out that your gun won't be shooting much longer. The enemy had clearly recognized the ammunition shortage as an opportunity to regain the initiative. Japanese units that had been pinned in defensive positions were beginning to move more boldly, taking advantage of the reduced American fire to reposition forces and prepare for offensive operations. The Marines could observe increased activity in areas that had been quiet for days, with enemy soldiers moving in daylight and establishing new firing positions at ranges that should have been suicidal. McVeigh made the decision to conserve his remaining ammunition for the most critical targets, abandoning the harassment fire that had been so effective in disrupting enemy operations. Each shot would have to count, not just tactically, but strategically used only against targets whose elimination would have maximum impact on Japanese capabilities. The casual precision shooting of the previous week was no longer sustainable given the resource constraints. The first test came at 10:30 hours when a Japanese machine gun team began setting up a Type 99 in a position that commanded the main supply route to the forward rifle companies. The enemy crew worked methodically, apparently confident that American long-range fire was no longer a threat. McVeigh had a clear shot at approximately 1,600 yards, but engaging the target would consume 3 to 5 of his precious remaining rounds. Hardin studied the position through field glasses, assessing the tactical significance. That gun can interdict the whole supply column, he observed. If they get it operational, nobody moves ammunition or medical supplies to the front companies. McVeigh settled behind his M2, adjusting the scope for the range and wind conditions. The Japanese machine gunners were moving casually, taking their time to place their weapon properly. They had no reason to expect incoming fire from a position they probably assumed was out of ammunition. The shot would be routine by the standards McVeigh had established, but it represented nearly 10% of his remaining capability. The 50 caliber round struck the primary gunner center mass, the impact throwing him backward into his assistant gunner and disrupting the entire imp placement effort. The surviving Japanese soldiers scrambled for cover, abandoning their weapon and fleeing deeper into the ridge complex. The supply route remained open, but McVeigh was down to 38 rounds. The real crisis developed that afternoon when Japanese forces began probing the Marine perimeter with small unit attacks that were clearly designed to test American response capabilities. Enemy squads would advance to positions just beyond rifle range, establish temporary firing positions, and engage Marine outposts with aimed fire before withdrawing. The attacks were coordinated and systematic, suggesting a larger plan to identify weak points in the American defensive line. Traditional doctrine called for machine gun crews to respond to such probing attacks with sustained suppressive fire, forcing the enemy to withdraw or take cover while friendly forces maneuvered. But McVeigh could not afford to expend his limited ammunition on suppression missions that might consume 20 or 30 rounds without achieving definitive results. He was forced to watch enemy soldiers operate at ranges where his weapon could reach them, knowing that engagement would exhaust his remaining capability. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. McVeigh had spent 2 weeks establishing dominance over the enemy-held ridges, creating a zone of American fire superiority that extended far beyond traditional small arms range. Japanese forces had modified their entire tactical approach in response to that capability, restricting their movements and abandoning positions they had held since the initial American landing. Now that dominance was slipping away, one precious cartridge at a time. At 1540 hours, the situation reached a breaking point. A Japanese sniper team established a position at 1,400 yards and began systematically engaging Marine forward observers, killing one spotter and wounding another within 30 minutes. The enemy marksmen were operating from a location that provided excellent concealment and fields of fire, clearly planning to remain in position for an extended engagement. They represented exactly the kind of high V-value target that justified expenditure of scarce 50 caliber ammunition. McVeigh engaged the position with 2 carefully aimed shots, the second round striking close enough to force the snipers to abandon their location, but the engagement reduced his remaining ammunition to 35 rounds, and he could see other Japanese positions becoming active as enemy forces sensed the reduced American fire capability. Hastings suggested a desperate expedient. What if we coordinate with the other heavy weapons crews, pool our remaining ammunition, and concentrate it on the most critical targets? The idea had merit, but it represented a fundamental change in tactical approach. Instead of individual crew operations, the remaining machine gun teams would have to function as a coordinated precision fire unit, sharing intelligence and ammunition resources while maintaining mutually supporting positions. The logistics would be complex, requiring radio coordination and careful planning to avoid duplication of effort. Lieutenant Phillips approved the concept immediately, recognizing that dispersed ammunition shortages were less critical than complete loss of long-range fire capability. By 1700 hours, 3 M2 crews had consolidated their remaining 50 caliber rounds into a single supply pool totaling 112 cartridges. The ammunition was distributed based on crew capability and target priority, with McVeigh's team receiving 45 rounds as the most experienced precision shooters. The Japanese counterattack began at 21:30 hours with mortar fire on Marine forward positions, followed by infantry probes against the perimeter at multiple points. Enemy forces moved with unusual boldness, apparently confident that American long-range fire was no longer effective. Japanese machine gun teams established positions at ranges that had been untenable just days earlier, and sniper teams began operating from locations they had previously abandoned. McVeigh's response was surgical. Instead of the sustained fire missions that had characterized earlier engagements, he fired single shots at the most critical targets: machine gun crews that threatened the Marine perimeter, sniper teams engaging American leadership, and observation posts directing enemy mortar fire. Each shot was planned and coordinated with the other precision crews to maximize tactical impact while conserving ammunition. By midnight, the coordinated precision fire had broken the Japanese counterattack, forcing enemy forces to withdraw to positions beyond effective range. The cost was 2850 caliber rounds, more than half of McVeigh's allocation, but the Marine perimeter held, and the enemy offensive collapsed. The innovation had worked, but barely, and only because the ammunition shortage had forced a level of tactical coordination that might never have developed under normal supply conditions. The Japanese resistance collapsed on July 15th, not from a single decisive engagement, but from the gradual erosion of will that came when soldiers realized their safe positions had become death traps. McVeigh watched through his scope as white flags appeared in cave mouths across the ridge complex, small pieces of cloth tied to rifle barrels and thrust cautiously into the morning sunlight. The enemy forces that had held these positions for nearly 3 weeks were surrendering in small groups, their ammunition exhausted and their confidence shattered by weeks of precision fire that had reached them at ranges they had believed impossible. The final ammunition resupply had arrived 2 days earlier, but by then the tactical situation had fundamentally changed. Japanese forces were no longer massing for counterattacks or attempting to establish new firing positions at extended range. Instead, they were huddled in the deepest portions of their cave systems, emerging only at night and only when absolutely necessary. The psychological dominance that precision machine gun fire had established was complete and irreversible. Lieutenant Phillips moved through the Marine positions that morning, coordinating the surrender procedures and ensuring that advancing infantry maintained appropriate caution despite the white flags. Enemy forces had been known to use surrender ruse, and the lieutenant was taking no chances with his men's safety, but the surrender appeared genuine. Japanese soldiers were emerging from positions with their hands raised, many showing signs of malnutrition and exhaustion that suggested weeks of minimal resupply. McVeigh remained at his position throughout the morning, maintaining overwatch on the surrender proceedings, even though active engagement seemed unlikely. His M2 was loaded with a fresh belt of 50 caliber ammunition, and his scope remained trained on the ridge complex, where pockets of Japanese resistance might still be hiding. The tactical situation required continued vigilance until the entire area was secured and searched by advancing infantry. The human cost of the campaign became evident as Marine patrols moved through the former enemy positions. The ridge complex contained dozens of improvised graves where Japanese soldiers had buried their dead during the 3-week siege. Many of the cave positions showed evidence of direct hits from 50 caliber fire with crater patterns and bloodstains that testified to the effectiveness of the precision shooting. McVeigh found himself studying these impact sites with mixed emotions, recognizing his own handiwork while contemplating the individual tragedies each crater represented. Sergeant Hardin conducted an informal after-action assessment of their ammunition expenditure and target engagement records. Over the course of the campaign, McVeigh's crew had fired approximately 430 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, achieving 17 confirmed kills and an estimated 25 additional casualties from near misses and fragmentation effects. The precision approach had delivered a casualty rate of nearly 10% per round fired, an effectiveness ratio that exceeded traditional machine gun employment by several orders of magnitude. But the raw numbers failed to capture the strategic impact of the innovation. The precision machine gun fire had forced an entire Japanese battalion to modify its tactical behavior, abandoning positions and restricting movement in ways that degraded their overall combat effectiveness far beyond the actual casualties inflicted. Enemy forces had spent weeks constructing additional fortifications and camouflage measures, diverting labor and resources from offensive preparations. The psychological effect had been multiplied through every level of the Japanese defensive structure. Lieutenant Phillips submitted a detailed report on the precision machine gun techniques to battalion headquarters, recommending immediate dissemination of the tactics to other Marine units operating in the Pacific Theater. The report included technical specifications for scope mounting, range estimation procedures, ammunition selection criteria, and coordination protocols with supporting arms. Phillips emphasized that the innovation had emerged from field experimentation rather than formal doctrine, suggesting that similar battlefield adaptations might be occurring throughout the theater. McVeigh spent the afternoon helping to process Japanese prisoners, many of whom expressed amazement at the accuracy of American long-range fire. Through interpreters, several enemy soldiers described the psychological impact of precision machine gun engagement, explaining how the knowledge that no position was truly safe had demoralized entire units. One Japanese corporal, who had served as a sniper throughout the campaign, admitted that he had abandoned several excellent firing positions because of fear of the big gun that shoots one bullet. The tactical lessons extended beyond the simple marksmanship. The precision machine gun concept had required fundamental changes in crew training, ammunition logistics, target acquisition procedures, and coordination with supporting units. Traditional machine gun employment emphasized volume of fire and area suppression, while precision work demanded individual shot accountability and careful resource management. The psychological and training requirements were as different as those between rifle and artillery employment. During the evening meal, McVeigh found himself in conversation with Marines from other units who had observed the precision shooting throughout the campaign. Several crews had attempted to replicate the techniques using their own M2 weapons with varying degrees of success. The innovation was spreading organically through the battalion, driven by tactical effectiveness rather than formal instruction. Similar adaptations were reportedly occurring in other Marine units across the Pacific, suggesting that the precision machine gun concept represented a natural evolution of battlefield tactics rather than an isolated experiment. The strategic implications were profound. Traditional military doctrine had assumed that machine guns were area weapons with limited precision capability beyond 800 to 1,000 yards. The demonstration that careful technique could extend effective range to 1,800 yards or more fundamentally altered the tactical equation for defensive positions and approach routes. Enemy forces could no longer assume safety at ranges that had been secure throughout previous conflicts. McVeigh cleaned his M2 that evening with unusual care, removing the improvised scope and returning the weapon to its standard configuration for the move to new positions. The campaign on Saipan was ending, but the tactical lessons would continue to influence Marine Corps doctrine throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The innovation had succeeded not because of superior equipment or training, but because of willingness to question fundamental assumptions about weapon capabilities and tactical employment. As the sun set over the captured ridges, McVeigh reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past 3 weeks. A machine gun crew trained for area suppression had become precision marksmen capable of engaging individual targets at extreme range. The change had required technical innovation, tactical adaptation, and psychological adjustment to new concepts of engagement and responsibility. But the core insight was simple. Weapons could perform beyond their design specifications when operators understood their true capabilities rather than accepting doctrinal limitations. The Marines would carry these lessons forward to subsequent campaigns at Tinian, Guam, and eventually Okinawa, where precision machine gun techniques would become standard operating procedures rather than battlefield innovations. McVeigh's experiment had demonstrated that tactical advantage often came not from superior equipment, but from superior understanding of existing capabilities. The innovation had changed how Marines thought about machine guns, range estimation, and the relationship between precision and firepower in modern warfare. The quiet that settled over the former battleground that night was different from the tense silence of active combat. It was the quiet of completion of tactical problems solved and strategic objectives achieved through the patient application of innovative thinking under extreme pressure. The altimeter reads 8,000 feet. Lieutenant Robert Bob Bram squints through the perspex canopy of his Bristol bow fighter as it cuts through the darkness over the North Sea. It's 2:47 a.m. on December 14th, 1941. His navigator, Flight Sergeant William Stix Gregory, hunches over his charts in the cramped rear compartment, pencil scratching against paper as he recalculates their position for the third time in 20 minutes. Gregory's hands are shaking, not from fear, but from the brutal cold seeping through the aircraft's thin aluminum skin. The temperature outside hovers at minus 15 degrees Celsius. Inside, it's barely warmer. His fingers, even wrapped in thick gloves, can barely grip the pencil. He's supposed to guide them back to RAF Wittering after a fruitless patrol hunting German bombers over the English Channel. But something is wrong with his calculations. Terribly wrong. The numbers don't match. According to his dead reckoning navigation, accounting for wind speed and direction, they should be approaching the English coast near Norfolk, but his stopwatch says they've been flying for 43 minutes since turning for home. At their cruising speed of 280 miles per hour, that puts them Gregory's stomach drops. That puts them at least 60 miles past where they should be. He's made a catastrophic error. Instead of calculating a westward heading to compensate for the northeasterly wind pushing them off course, he's done the opposite. He's added degrees when he should have subtracted them. It's the kind of mistake that gets air crews killed. The kind that ends with a bow fighter slamming into the cold North Sea with no one ever knowing what happened. Stix, Where the hell are we? Bram's voice crackles through the intercom, tension evident even through the static. We should be seeing the coast by now. Gregory opens his mouth to confess his error, to tell his pilot they're hopelessly lost over enemy-controlled waters. But before he can speak, Bram's voice cuts through again, sharp and urgent. Wait, lights dead ahead, multiple lights. What neither of them knows in this moment is that Gregory's mathematical error hasn't doomed them. It's about to hand British intelligence the location of one of Nazi Germany's most secret airfields. A discovery that will alter the course of the air war and save thousands of Allied lives. By December 1941, the Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign against Britain has evolved into a deadly game of cat and mouse. After the devastating Blitz of 1940-1941, German bomber crews have refined their tactics. They no longer attack in massive formations that British radar can easily detect. Instead, they operate from secret forward airfields along the occupied European coast, launching small groups of aircraft on precision night raids against British cities and industrial targets. British air intelligence knows these forward bases exist. They have to. German bombers are appearing over British targets with disturbing regularity. Yet reconnaissance flights over known Luftwaffe airfields in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands show normal activity levels. The mathematics are simple and terrifying. The Germans are operating from hidden airfields that British intelligence hasn't located. The consequences of this intelligence gap are measured in blood and rubble. Between September and December 1941, German night raiders kill 1 ACAR, 47 British civilians, and destroy countless factories, warehouses, and infrastructure. RAF Fighter Command throws everything at the problem. They increase night patrols, they deploy more radar stations along the coast, they send reconnaissance aircraft on dangerous daylight missions over occupied Europe, searching for the hidden bases. The results are dismal. In 3 months of intensive searching, RAF reconnaissance has identified only 2 previously unknown German airfields, both minor facilities. Meanwhile, German bombers continue their raids with impunity. The Luftwaffe's operational security is nearly perfect. They've learned from earlier mistakes. Their secret airfields maintain strict radio silence. They use camouflage netting and dummy buildings to deceive aerial reconnaissance. They even rotate aircraft between bases to prevent British intelligence from tracking specific units. Air Chief Marshal Sir Sholto Douglas, commanding RAF Fighter Command, faces a strategic nightmare. His night fighters are flying blind, literally and figuratively. Without knowing where German bombers are launching from, his aircraft waste precious fuel and time patrolling empty stretches of the North Sea and English Channel. The kill ratio tells the grim story. In November 1941, RAF night fighters fly 847 combat patrols. They achieve only 12 confirmed kills of German bombers. That's a success rate of 1.4%. For every German bomber destroyed, British night fighters burn through all 18,000 gallons of aviation fuel and risk multiple air crews in dangerous night operations. The expert consensus within RAF intelligence is unanimous and depressing. Without better radar coverage, without more sophisticated detection equipment, without signals intelligence breakthroughs, they cannot locate the secret German airfields. The technology simply doesn't exist yet. Squadron leader Derek Jackson, one of the RAF's top radar experts, writes in a classified memo dated November 28, 1941, "The current generation of airborne radar cannot reliably detect ground installations from operationally safe altitudes. We are, in effect, asking our air crews to search for needles in a haystack the size of continental Europe. The stakes extend beyond the immediate tactical problem. British code reekers at Bletchley Park are making progress, breaking German military communications, but they need physical evidence to validate their intelligence. If they can locate a secret German airfield and observe its operations, they can cross-reference that data with decoded German messages. This would confirm their code-reeking methods are accurate and help them break additional German codes." Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself is demanding answers. In a heated war cabinet meeting on December 10, 1941, he pounds the table and declares, "We are being struck by an invisible enemy. This is intolerable. I want those airfields found, and I want them found now." 4 days later, Flight Sergeant William Gregory will accidentally give Churchill exactly what he's demanding, though not in any way the Prime Minister or anyone else could have anticipated. William Gregory is nobody's idea of a hero. At 23 years old, he's a former grocery clerk from Nottingham who joined the RAF in 1939 because it seemed more exciting than stacking tins of beans. He barely passed his navigation training course at RAF Cranwell, graduating 47th out of 52 students. His instructors noted in his file, adequate mathematical, clears throat skills, tends to rush calculations, requires additional supervision. That assessment is generous. Gregory knows he's not a natural navigator, unlike some of his classmates who seem to instinctively understand celestial navigation and dead reckoning. He has to work twice as hard to achieve half the results. He carries a worn notebook filled with formulas and correction factors, constantly referring to it during flights because he can't keep the calculations straight in his head. His pilot, Lieutenant Robert Bram, is his opposite in almost every way. At 20, Bram is already an ace with 7 confirmed kills. He's cool under pressure, decisive, and possesses the kind of natural flying ability that makes instructors shake their heads in wonder. He's also unusually patient with his navigator. While other pilots in the squadron complain about their navigator's mistakes, Bram never does. He seems to understand that Gregory is doing his best, even when his best falls short. On the night of December 14th, 1941, they're flying their third patrol of the week. It's tedious, exhausting work. They take off from RAF Wittering at 11:30 p.m., climb to patrol altitude, and spend hours flying search patterns over the North Sea, hunting for German bombers that may or may not be there. The cold is brutal. The darkness is absolute. The only light comes from the faint glow of the instrument panel and the occasional glimpse of stars through breaks in the clouds. Gregory's moment of insight comes not through brilliance, but through desperate rechecking of his work. As Bram reports seeing lights ahead, Gregory frantically recalculates their position. He works backward from their takeoff time, their airspeeds, their headings. He factors in the wind data he received from the meteorological officer before takeoff, and then he sees it, his error. He's been compensating for the wind in the wrong direction for the entire return leg. His first reaction is pure panic. They're not approaching England. They're flying deeper into enemy-controlled airspace. They're somewhere over the Netherlands or northern Germany. Those lights Bram is seeing aren't British, they're German. His second reaction changes everything. If those are German lights and they're this far from the known German airfields and there are multiple lights suggesting a major installation, then they've found something important. Bob, Gregory's voice is tight as he speaks into the intercom. Those aren't our lights. We're over enemy territory. I made a navigation error. We're approximately 60 miles east of where we should be. There's a long pause. Then Bram's voice, surprisingly calm. Well then, sticks. Let's take a closer look, shall we? Bram banks the bow fighter into a gentle turn, reducing altitude to 6,000 feet. Gregory's heart hammers against his ribs. Everything about this is wrong. They're deep in enemy airspace with no authorization, no backup, and barely enough fuel to make it home. If they turn back immediately, if German fighters scramble, they're dead. If German anti-aircraft batteries open fire, they're dead. If they run out of fuel over the North Sea, they're dead. But Bram keeps descending 5,000 feet, 4,000 feet. The lights grow clearer. Gregory can see them now from his rear-facing position, craning his neck to look past the bow fighter's tail. Not just lights. Dozens of lights arranged in patterns that can only mean one thing: a major airfield. I'm seeing runway lights, Bram reports, his voice steady despite the insanity of what they're doing. Multiple runways, large installation. There are aircraft on the ground. I count at least 20 aircraft, maybe more. Gregory fumbles with his navigation equipment, trying to get an exact position fix. His hands are shaking worse than ever, but now it's from adrenaline rather than cold. He takes a bearing on the lights, cross-references it with his calculated position, and makes careful notes. They need to be able to find this place again. They need to be able to tell intelligence exactly where it is. There are bombers down there, Bram continues, Hankel 111s, Junkers 88s. This is a major bomber base. Sticks. This is exactly what intelligence has been looking for. The Beaufighter makes a wide orbit around the airfield at 3,500 feet. Gregory takes more bearings, more notes. He can see the layout now. 3 runways arranged in a triangle pattern, dozens of aircraft dispersed around the perimeter, hangars, fuel storage tanks, barracks, buildings. This isn't a forward operating base. This is a full-scale Luftwaffe bomber station. And then the searchlights snap on. Brilliant white beams lance into the darkness, sweeping the sky, searching for the intruder. Anti-aircraft tracers arc upward, bright red chains of death reaching toward them. The Germans have finally realized they have an uninvited guest. Time to leave. Bram shoves the throttles forward and throws the Beaufighter into a diving turn. The aircraft shudders as flak bursts explode nearby, close enough that Gregory can hear the sharp crack of detonations over the engine roar. They're running for their lives now, racing westward at full speed. The German searchlights and tracers falling away behind them. Gregory keeps working through the escape, refining his calculations, making absolutely certain of their position, because he knows what's going to happen when they land. He's going to have to explain how they ended up over enemy territory. He's going to have to admit his navigation error. He's going to face an inquiry, possibly a court-martial, definitely the end of his flying career, but he's also going to hand British intelligence the biggest intelligence breakthrough of the air war, and that makes everything worth it. They land at RAF Wittering at 4:23 a.m. With their fuel tanks nearly empty, Bram taxis to their dispersal area and shuts down the engines. For a moment, both men sit in silence, processing what just happened. Then Bram's voice comes through the intercom one last time. Sticks. Whatever happens, we did the right thing. Remember that. The debriefing begins immediately. The intelligence officer, Flight Lieutenant James Harrington, listens to their report with increasing skepticism. When Gregory admits his navigation error, Harrington's expression hardens. When Bram describes the airfield they discovered, Harrington's skepticism turns to outright disbelief. "Let me understand this correctly," Harrington says, his voice dripping with disdain. "You flew 60 miles off course due to a navigation error. You then deliberately penetrated enemy airspace without authorization. You descended to low altitude over what you claim is a secret German airfield, and you expect me to believe this airfield exists based on a visual sighting by a crew that was hopelessly lost? Sir, I have the exact coordinates," Gregory protests, pushing his notebook across the table. "I took multiple bearings. I can show you exactly where it is." Harrington barely glances at the notebook. "Flight Sergeant, you've already admitted you made a catastrophic navigation error. Why should I trust any of your calculations? For all I know, you saw a Dutch civilian airfield and mistook it for a German bomber base." The meeting escalates. Braum, normally calm, raises his voice. "I know what I saw, sir. That was a major Luftwaffe installation. There were at least 20 bombers on the ground. At night, from 3,500 feet. While being shot at, Harrington shakes his head. "Your report is noted, Lieutenant, but I cannot recommend any action based on such unreliable intelligence. You're both grounded, pending an investigation into this unauthorized incursion into enemy airspace." The news spreads through the squadron by breakfast. Gregory faces a mixture of sympathy and ridicule from his fellow navigators. Some believe his story, others think he's trying to cover up his mistake with a fantastic tale. The consensus among the senior officers is clear. Gregory screwed up, and now he's making excuses, but one person believes them. Wing Commander Basil Embry, the station commander, has a reputation as a maverick. He's flown dozens of dangerous missions himself. He understands that sometimes the best intelligence comes from accidents and mistakes. When he reads Harrington's dismissive report, he makes a decision that will change everything. Embry calls a meeting in his office on December 15th. Present are Bram, Gregory Harrington, Squadron Leader Derek Jackson from RAF Intelligence, and Group Captain Victor Beisch, the sector commander. The room is tense from the moment they assemble. "Gentlemen," Embry begins, "we have a potential intelligence breakthrough, and I will not allow it to be dismissed because it came about through unorthodox means." Harrington immediately objects. "Sir, with respect, we cannot base operational decisions on unreliable sightings from a crew that was lost. That's exactly my point." Jackson adds, "We've been searching for these secret airfields for months. Every credible lead has turned into a dead end. Now we're supposed to believe that a navigation error accidentally led to the discovery of a major German base. The odds against that are astronomical. The room erupts. Voices overlap as multiple officers argue simultaneously. Harrington insists that authorizing a reconnaissance mission based on Gregory's coordinates would be a waste of resources. Jackson argues that even if the airfield exists, The Germans will have moved everything after being spotted. Beamish worries about risking valuable reconnaissance aircraft on what might be a wild goose chase. Embry lets them argue for 5 minutes. Then he slams his hand on the desk, silencing the room. Enough. Here's what we're going to do. We will send a single reconnaissance Spitfire to Gregory's coordinates tomorrow morning. If the airfield is there, we've made the biggest intelligence discovery of the year. If it's not, we've wasted one reconnaissance sortie. That's a risk I'm willing to take. He turns to Gregory. Flight Sergeant, you'd better be right about this, because if you're wrong, your career is over. Gregory swallows hard. I'm right, sir. I stake my life on it. Before you navigate away, remember to subscribe to Last Words and hit that notification bell. We're bringing you the untold stories of military history that changed the world 3 times a week. Don't miss the next one. December 16th, 1941, dawn clear and cold over eastern England. At RAF Benson, Flight Lieutenant Antony Tony Hill climbs into his Spitfire PRM-K4, a reconnaissance variant stripped of weapons and painted in distinctive pale blue camouflage. His mission is simple: fly to the coordinates provided by Gregory, photograph whatever is there and return. He's been briefed on the controversy surrounding this mission. Half the intelligence staff thinks it's a waste of time. The other half hopes desperately that Gregory is right. Hill takes off at 8:47 a.m. He climbs to 28,000 feet and sets course for the Dutch coast. At that altitude, he's above the effective range of most German anti-aircraft guns. The sky is crystal clear, perfect conditions for reconnaissance photography. He reaches Gregory's coordinates at 9:34 a.m. What he sees through his viewfinder makes him forget to breathe for a moment. There, exactly where Gregory said it would be, is a massive airfield. Hill makes 3 passes, his cameras clicking away, capturing every detail. He counts 43 aircraft on the ground, including bombers, fighters, and transport planes. He photographs the runways, the hangars, the fuel storage facilities, the barracks. He captures everything. When Hill lands back at RAF Benson at 11:12 a.m., he's grinning like a schoolboy. It's there, he tells the intelligence officers who rush to meet him. Everything they said, it's all there. This is the real thing. The photographs are developed within hours. They're rushed to RAF Intelligence Headquarters at Bentley Priory. By evening, they're on Air Chief Marshal Douglas's desk. The analysis confirms Hill's initial assessment. This is Gila Ryan Airfield in the Netherlands, a major Luftwaffe bomber base that British intelligence had no idea existed. German records captured after the war reveal that Gilsa Ryan was home to Kampfkampf 30, a bomber wing equipped with Junkers 88s that had been conducting night raids against Britain since September 1941. The impact of this discovery is immediate and profound. Within 24 hours, RAF Bomber Command is planning a major raid on Gila Ryan. But first, British intelligence wants to observe the base to learn its operational patterns, to identify when bombers launch and return. For 3 weeks, reconnaissance aircraft photograph Gilsa Rajan daily. British signals intelligence monitors its radio traffic. The intelligence picture becomes crystal clear. This is one of the Luftwaffe's primary night bombing bases for operations against Britain. On January 7th, 1942, RAF Bomber Command strikes. 48 Bristol Blenheim bombers escorted by Spitfires attack Gilsa Ryan in broad daylight. The raid is devastatingly successful. Bombs destroy 2 hangars, damage the main runway, and destroy or damage 17 German aircraft on the ground. German casualties include 23 dead and 41 wounded. More importantly, Gilsa Ryan is knocked out of operation for 11 days. But the real value of discovering Gila Ryan extends far beyond that single raid. British intelligence now knows what to look for. They analyze the characteristics that made Gila Ryan an effective secret base. Its location near the coast, but not directly on it, its camouflage techniques, its dispersal patterns. They use this knowledge to identify 3 more secret German airfields within the next month: Leeuwarden in the Netherlands, Soesterberg near Utrecht, and Schiphol near Amsterdam. The statistics tell the story of how this discovery changes the air war. In the 3 months before Gilsa Ryan is discovered, German night bombers fly 347 sorties against British targets with a loss rate of only 3.7%. In the 3 months after the discovery and subsequent raids on the secret airfields, German sorties drop to 198 and their loss rate climbs to 8.4%. British night fighters, now able to patrol near known German airfields, achieve a kill ratio improvement of 127%. The human cost is equally significant. British civilian casualties from German night bombing dropped from an average of 416 per month in the September-December 1941 period to 187 per month in the January-March 1942 period. That's 687 British lives saved in just 3 months, directly attributable to the disruption of German bomber operations following the discovery of their secret airfields. German records provide the enemy perspective. Heimann Klaus Hübner, a bomber pilot with KF Kos 30 based at Gills of Ryan, wrote in his diary after the January 7th raid, "The British have found us. Our sanctuary is no longer safe. We thought we were invisible, but somehow they have pierced our veil of secrecy. Morale is suffering. The men know that we are now vulnerable, that the British bombers will return, and return they did." Between January and June 1942, RAF Bomber Command conducts 17 separate raids on the 4 secret airfields, discovered as a result of Gregory's navigation error. These raids destroy or damage 127 German aircraft on the ground, kill or wound 342 German personnel, and force the Luftwaffe to divert significant resources to air defense that would otherwise have been used for offensive operations. For Gregory and Bram, the discovery brings vindication but also continued danger. They're not grounded. Instead, they're assigned to continue flying night patrols, now armed with knowledge of where German bombers are operating from. On February 23, 1942, Bram shoots down a Hankel 111 bomber near Gills of Ryan. It's his 8th kill. He will go on to become one of the RAF's top night fighter aces with 29 confirmed kills by war's end. Gregory continues as Bram's navigator through 1942 and into 1943. Despite his rocky start, he becomes one of the RAF's most reliable navigators. His commanding officers note in his later evaluations has developed into an exceptional navigator. His attention to detail and willingness to check his work makes him a model for other navigators to emulate. The ultimate validation comes from an unexpected source. In March 1942, Gregory receives a letter from a bomber pilot he's never met, Flight Lieutenant Michael Stevens. Stevens writes, "I was part of the raid on Kilo Ryan on January 7th. We destroyed German bombers that would have killed British civilians. We disrupted operations that would have cost British lives. Because of your discovery, because of your willingness to admit your mistake and report what you found, my crew and I came home safely from that mission. Because of you, we came home." If you're enjoying this story of how one man's mistake changed military history, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who loves military history. Your support helps us continue bringing these incredible stories to life. The full scope of William Gregory's accidental discovery isn't revealed until after the war, when British intelligence declassifies its files on the secret German airfields in 1949. Historians are stunned by the cascading effects of that single navigation error on December 14, 1941. The discovery of Gilzerian directly led to the identification of 17 additional secret or camouflaged German airfields across occupied Europe by the end of 1942. The intelligence methodology developed from analyzing Gilzerian understanding how the Germans selected and camouflaged their secret bases became standard practice for Allied photo-renaissance interpreters. This methodology was later applied to identifying German VW weapon sites, submarine pens, and radar installations. The production numbers are staggering. Between January 1942 and May 1945, Allied bombers conducted 347 raids on airfields, first identified using the techniques developed from the Gilzerian discovery. These raids destroyed or damaged 4,127 German aircraft on the ground, killed or captured 11,433 German personnel, and disrupted countless bombing missions that would have targeted Allied cities and military installations. Air Chief Marshal Sir Sholto Douglas, in his post-war memoirs published in 1963, wrote, "The discovery of Gills of Ryan was a turning point in the air war over Europe. It demonstrated that German operational security, while excellent, was not impenetrable. It gave us the tools and the confidence to systematically hunt down and neutralize the Luftwaffe's secret infrastructure. And it all came about because a young navigator made a mistake and had the courage to report what he found." The modern legacy of Gregory's discovery extends into current military doctrine. The principle that intelligence breakthroughs often come from unexpected sources, including mistakes and accidents, is now taught at military intelligence schools worldwide. The U.S. Air Force Intelligence School at Goodfellow Air Force Base includes the Gilzeruan discovery in its curriculum as a case study in the importance of reporting all observations, even those resulting from errors. As for Gregory himself, he refused all attempts to make him famous. After the war, he returned to Nottingham and resumed working in retail, managing a grocery store until his retirement in 1979. He rarely spoke about his wartime service when reporters occasionally tracked him down for interviews. He deflected credit to Bram, to the reconnaissance pilots who confirmed his discovery to the bomber crews who struck the German airfields. In 1988, at age 70, Gregory gave his only extensive interview to an RAF historian. His final words on the subject capture the humility that defined his character. "I made a mistake, a potentially fatal mistake. But Bob Bram had the sense to investigate what we found. And Wing Commander Embry had the courage to believe us. I was just the navigator who got the math wrong. They were the real heroes." William Gregory died in 1994 at age 76. His obituary in the Nottingham Post mentioned his wartime service in a single sentence. But in the archives of RAF intelligence, in the history books that chronicle the air war over Europe, his name appears alongside the greatest intelligence breakthroughs of World War II. All because one cold December night, he subtracted when he should have added and accidentally changed the course of history. It is the 9th of February 1943, somewhere in the Black Atlantic swell of the Bay of Biscay, and Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Hansen has just given the order to surface. His U-boat has spent 11 hours submerged, its batteries drained to almost nothing, its air thick and stale, and now, under cover of what should be perfect darkness, the boat breaks the surface in a boil of white foam. Diesel engines cough into life. Fresh air floods the hull. Somewhere below deck, a wireless operator checks the METOX receiver, the little wooden case device nicknamed the Biscay Cross, and confirms what the captain already expects. No radar signals detected, the sky is clear, the sea is empty. Hansen allows himself to relax. He has done this 100 times before. And then, without warning, without so much as a flicker on the METOX needle, a beam of impossibly bright light stabs down out of the night sky directly above his conning tower, and seconds later the sea around him erupts. There was no warning, because there could be no warning. The aircraft that found him, or the escort vessel that found him, was using a wavelength his equipment was never built to hear. This is the story of the Type 271, the device that let Britain see U-boats that believed themselves invisible, and in doing so turned the Bay of Biscay, once a safe corridor for the Kriegsmarine, into a graveyard that German submariners learned to dread more than any depth charge. By the winter of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had become a war of instruments as much as a war of ships. Britain's survival depended on convoys, roughly 40 ships at a time, crossing thousands of kilometers of open ocean carrying food, fuel, and munitions from North America. Germany's answer was the Wolf Pack, dozens of U-boats hunting in loose coordination, and the numbers were becoming catastrophic. In November 1942 alone, Allied shipping losses topped 700,000 gross tons, the worst single month of the entire war. Britain was an island nation that could not feed itself without those convoys, and every U-boat that slipped through unseen brought the country closer to strangulation. The existing tools for finding submarines had a fundamental flaw. Standard metric radar, operating at wavelengths of roughly 1.5 meters, could detect a surfaced U-boat, but the wavelength was long enough that German engineers had already built a countermeasure. The METOX receiver, cheap, simple, and fitted to almost every U-boat by early 1942, could hear the pulse of Allied metric radar from many kilometers away, giving a submarine ample warning to crash dive long before any attacking aircraft or ship came close. It meant that a U-boat commander, cruising on the surface at night to recharge his batteries and make better speed, could travel with something approaching confidence. He had a warning system. He believed himself, if not invulnerable, then at least forewarned. And a forewarned U-boat was a U-boat that survived. The problem, from the British perspective, was not simply to build a better radar. It was to build a radar operating on a wavelength so short that no existing German receiver, not METOX, not anything on the drawing board, could possibly detect it. That meant abandoning meter wavelength technology entirely and working in the centimetric range, wavelengths of 10 centimeters or less, a region of the spectrum that in 1940 nobody had managed to generate with any useful power. It was, in the language of the time, considered close to impossible. And then, at the University of Birmingham, two physicists solved it almost by accident. In February 1940, John Randall and Harry Boot, working with limited resources and a wartime sense of urgency, built a working cavity magnetron, a valve about the size of a shoebox that could generate roughly 1 kilowatt of power at a wavelength of just 10 centimeters. It was an extraordinary leap. Previous microwave sources had been feeble, laboratory curiosities incapable of any practical range. The cavity magnetron changed that overnight, and Britain's Admiralty Signal Establishment, working with the Navy's own valve laboratory, moved with unusual speed to turn the invention into a working shipboard radar set. The result was the Type 271. It operated at a wavelength of roughly 9.7 centimeters, in what would later be called the S-band, and its antenna, housed in a distinctive weatherproof enclosure that sailors nicknamed the double cheese for its shape, could be fitted to almost any vessel from a corvette upward. Early sets, first properly engineered and tested aboard the corvette HMS Orcus by March 1941, produced only 5 to 7 kilowatts of peak power, modest by later standards, roughly comparable to the output of a large household generator, but concentrated into a beam narrow and short enough to reveal something no metric radar ever could: the low, wet silhouette of a U-boat's conning tower breaking the surface of the sea. Where older sets struggled to distinguish a submarine from wave clutter, the Type 271 could pick out a surfaced U-boat at a range of 3 to 5 kilometers, and larger targets considerably further. Production moved quickly by wartime standards. The magnetron valves themselves were manufactured near Birmingham, close to where they had been invented, while the amplifier and display units came from the Marconi factory at Chelmsford. By the end of 1941, only around 30 sets had reached the fleet, but the pace accelerated sharply through 1942. By May of that year, well over 200 Royal Navy vessels, from destroyers down to small escort corvettes, carried the new centimetric radar. It was, quietly, one of the most consequential rearmaments of the naval war, achieved without the Germans having the faintest idea it existed. The results came almost immediately. On November 16, 1941, the sinking of U-433 near Gibraltar was directly attributed to detection by the new Type 271 set, one of the very first confirmed kills credited to centimetric radar. But the technology's real value was psychological as much as material, and it took over a year for the Germans to even understand what was happening to them. Throughout 1942 and into early 1943, U-boat commanders began reporting a disturbing pattern: attacks with no warning whatsoever. METOX showed nothing. The sky was empty one moment, and then a searchlight, often the airborne Lee light, working in concert with the new radar, was burning down onto their hull, or an escort vessel was suddenly bearing down out of what had seemed a perfectly clear night. Submarines were being found and attacked as though the Royal Navy could simply see through darkness itself, and there was no equipment on board capable of telling a crew why. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing. German naval intelligence spent months chasing the wrong theory entirely, suspecting spies, code breaks, even supernatural detection methods, before the truth arrived by accident. On February 2nd, 1943, an RAF Sterling bomber fitted with the equivalent centimetric H-2S ground mapping radar was shot down near Rotterdam. German technicians recovered the wreckage and, crucially, the intact magnetron valve inside it. Only then did they understand that the Allies possessed radar operating on a wavelength their entire detection network was blind to. The response, a new receiver codenamed Naxos, capable of hearing centimetric transmissions, did not reach U-boats in any numbers until September and November 1943, by which point the Type 271 and its airborne cousin had already inflicted catastrophic losses through the Bay of Biscay transit routes. The narrow stretch of water every German U-boat had to cross to reach the open Atlantic from its French bases. It is worth comparing what Germany attempted in response, because the gap was not merely temporal but technological. German radar research had continued to focus on longer metric wavelengths well into 1943, partly from resource constraints and partly from a mistaken assumption that centimetric radar remained beyond Allied capability, the same assumption that had left METOX useless in the first place. When Naxos finally arrived, it was a stopgap receiver bolted onto a crisis rather than a matched, purpose-built countermeasure, and Allied engineers continued improving the Type 271 in the meantime. By early 1943, an upgraded version known as the Q model or Mark IV introduced a far more powerful 70 kilowatt magnetron and added a plan position indicator display, a circular screen showing a genuine picture of the surrounding sea rather than a simple blip, which let escort commanders coordinate interceptions with startling precision. American radar development, though formidable in its own right and eventually surpassing British sets in some respects, was working from British shared cavity magnetron technology from the outset, following an agreement in 1940 that saw the invention handed to American industry specifically because British manufacturing capacity alone could not meet wartime demand. In that sense, the entire Allied centimetric radar effort, British and American alike, traced back to that shoebox-sized valve built at Birmingham. The material impact was significant, but the psychological impact may have been greater still. By the spring and summer of 1943, U-boat losses in the Bay of Biscay had risen to a point that Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding Germany's submarine fleet, was forced to reconsider the entire transit strategy, at one stage ordering boats to cross submerged wherever possible, rather than risk the surface passage that centimetric radar had made so lethal. A tactic that had worked reliably for 3 years of war had, within a matter of months, become something crews approached with genuine dread, the fear not of a weapon they could see coming, but of one they could not detect at all, until it was already too late to dive. Surviving records suggest that morale among Biscay transit crews deteriorated sharply through 1943, though exact figures on psychological strain are, inevitably, harder to document than tonnage sunk. Combined with the near-simultaneous arrival of airborne ASV Mark III radar, the high-frequency direction-finding equipment nicknamed Huff Duff, and renewed Allied access to German naval Enigma traffic, the Type 271 formed part of a cluster of innovations that historians generally agree swung the Mid-Atlantic War decisively in the Allies' favour during 1943, a year in which German submarine losses rose so steeply that Dönitz was eventually forced to withdraw his wolf packs from the North Atlantic convoy routes altogether. Later variants of the centimetric family, including the far more powerful Type 277 with its half-megawatt magnetron, extended the same principle through the remainder of the war, and in October 1943, an advanced 273 series set aboard HMS Duke of York helped locate the German battleship Scharnhorst at night, contributing to its destruction at the Battle of the North Cape, a reminder that the same technology built to hunt submarines proved just as devastating against surface raiders. Today, examples of the Type 271 and its successor sets survive in naval museum collections in Britain, alongside preserved escort vessels of the period, though the distinctive double cheese antenna housing is now a rare sight, more often seen in photographs than in the metal. What remains far more visible is the shape of the problem the Type 271 solved, and the manner in which it solved it, which is a template repeated again and again through the history of technological warfare. An enemy builds a countermeasure against the weapon he expects, and is undone by the one he does not. Klaus Hansen is a composite, not a documented individual, but the moment described in this film's opening happened, in its essential shape, to real crews on real nights throughout 1943 in the waters between occupied France and the open Atlantic. Men who trusted a small wooden box to warn them of danger discovered, in the worst possible circumstances, that the box had gone silent not because the danger had passed, but because the danger had changed entirely, moved to a frequency their instruments could not perceive. That is the quiet, unglamorous power of the Type 271. It did not need to be larger, louder, or more destructive than what came before it. It needed only to be invisible to the one system built specifically to detect it, and in the waters of the Bay of Biscay in 1943, invisibility proved deadlier than any depth charge ever dropped. German U-boats did not flee the Type 271 because they saw it coming. They fled it when they fled it at all, because for the first time in the war, they could not see it coming, and by then, for a great many crews, it was already far too late.
It is just gone 10 o'clock on the morning of 12th February 1946, and the sea, roughly 100 miles northwest of Ireland, is doing what it has done for most of the winter, heaving, gray, and entirely indifferent to history. A handful of Royal Navy vessels sit in the swell, watching a long, dark shape roll in the waves ahead of them. She is a Type 21 submarine, one of the most advanced underwater vessels built by any nation on Earth in 1945, capable of submerged speeds no submarine had ever sustained before, and, remarkably, for the very first time in submarine history, genuinely faster underwater than on the surface. Her name is U-3514. Within minutes, she will be sent to the bottom, in water far too deep for anyone to ever raise her again. When she disappears beneath the surface, she will become the last of 116 German U-boats sunk in a Royal Navy operation, given the curiously understated codename Deadlight. It sounds like the end of a story, and in one sense it is. But the real question the Allies spent the best part of 2 years and 3 governments answering was never simply how to sink Germany's surviving U-boats. It was what to do with a fleet that had come closer than almost any other weapon of the war to starving Britain into submission. That included submarines so advanced they would go on to shape every major navy's underwater strategy for the next 40 years, and that Germany's own naval command had tried, in its final days, to destroy rather than hand over intact. What really happened to those U-boats after the war is a story of scuttling orders given and withdrawn within minutes of each other, of submarines raised from the floor of German harbors because their engines were judged too valuable to leave there, and of a quiet, methodical disposal effort whose physical results are still lying on the seabed northwest of Ireland today. It matters because the way this single defeated fleet was divided up, studied, and sunk did more to shape Cold War submarine warfare than almost any naval battle fought during the war itself. To understand why disposing of a beaten navy could possibly take 2 years and 3 governments, it helps to remember exactly what that navy had nearly achieved. At its peak strength, the German U-boat arm numbered roughly 460 commissioned boats, although a great many of those were finished too late in the war to see active service or even train a full crew. Even so, over 6 years of fighting, U-boats sank thousands of Allied merchant ships and dozens of warships, repeatedly threatening to sever the lifeline of fuel, food, and war material that kept Britain in the fight at all. The cost to the U-boat arm itself was almost unimaginable. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served aboard German submarines, an estimated 28,000 never came home, a casualty rate of close to 3 in 4, the worst suffered by any service of any major combatant nation in the entire war. By May 1945, that long and brutal campaign had already claimed the great majority of the fleet. The boats that remained when Germany finally collapsed were not the bulk of what had once existed. They were what was left. And what was left mattered enormously, because among the survivors were Germany's newest submarines, the so-called Elektroboote, designed not as surface ships that occasionally dived, but as true submarines built to fight primarily underwater. The Allies had known about these boats for some time and feared them deeply. Germany's own naval high command, in its final days, faced an agonizing choice over the entire fleet: hand this technology and these crews over intact, or destroy everything rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, who had commanded the U-boat arm for most of the war and inherited leadership of what remained of Germany after Hitler's suicide on April 30th, 1945, chose in principle destruction. The code word for that destruction was Regenbogen, rainbow. Even before any formal order was transmitted, German crews along the Baltic and North Sea coasts had begun wrecking their own boats rather than risk capture. 3 U-boats went down at Warnemünde on 1 May. 32 more followed at Travemünde the next day. By 3 May, as Dönitz's emissary tried and failed to negotiate an armistice with Field Marshal Montgomery at Lüneburg, a further 39 boats had been destroyed at Kiel and Hamburg. Montgomery's price for accepting any German surrender in the north was explicit. The U-boat arm had to be handed over intact, not scuttled. In the early hours of 5 May, with that surrender about to take effect, the Regenbogen order was finally transmitted in full and withdrawn again just 8 minutes later, German naval staff desperate not to wreck the negotiations at the 11th hour. It made remarkably little difference. Convinced the countermand was a formality rather than a genuine change of heart, commanders up and down the German coast carried on regardless. 64 more boats were destroyed in the Baltic that day alone, and a further 23 on the North Sea coast. By the time Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8th, something approaching 200 U-boats had been deliberately wrecked or scuttled by their own crews, comfortably more than the number that would go on to surrender intact, most of them destroyed in port, several within hours of the ceasefire actually coming into force. That left, by most historians' reckoning, somewhere in the region of 156 U-boats to be formally surrendered, some at sea, flying the black flag of surrender as ordered and escorted into Allied harbors by whichever warship or aircraft happened upon them first, the rest in port across occupied Norway, Denmark, and northern Germany, where crews disarmed their boats and waited under guard. A handful chose flight over surrender altogether. 2 boats fled to neutral Portugal, where their crews scuttled them rather than hand them over to anyone, and 2 more crossed the entire Atlantic to surrender extraordinarily to the authorities in neutral Argentina, arriving months after the fighting in Europe had ended. The great majority of the surrendered fleet, however, ended up moored at 2 enormous holding anchorages. Lisa Halley on the River Foyle in Northern Ireland, where the Royal Navy had established a shore base known as HMS Ferret, and Loch Ryan on the Scottish coast. Surviving photographs from that summer show row upon row of gray conning towers, dozens of boats rafted together, guarded and largely unmanned, an entire defeated navy waiting, quite literally, to be told what would happen to it next. That decision came from the very top. At the Potsdam Conference between 17 July and 2 August 1945, the leaders of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union agreed to establish a tripartite naval commission to settle the matter, and the commission began its formal work on 15 August. Its task was to inspect the surrendered fleet, by then well over 100 boats at Lisa Halley and Loch Ryan alone, plus a handful that had surrendered directly to American and Canadian forces, and decide what would happen to each one. By 10th October, the commission had its answer. 30 U-boats would be retained, 10 apiece by Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, purely for technical study. The remaining 116 would be sunk. The boats each power wanted most were not the standard wartime workhorses, but the handful of genuinely revolutionary designs Germany had rushed into service far too late to matter militarily. Chief among these was the Type 21, a submarine with battery capacity more than double that of earlier boats and fitted with a snorkel breathing tube that let her run diesel engines and recharge those batteries without ever exposing more than a slim mast to a patrolling aircraft's radar. It was, in effect, the underwater equivalent of swapping a rowing boat for a torpedo. Nothing else afloat in 1945 could match her submerged performance, and the Allied anti-submarine tactics built around forcing U-boats to surface to recharge would have struggled badly with her in any numbers. Mercifully for the Allies, she arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. Of well over 121 Type 21s commissioned, only one, U-2511, ever completed a war patrol, sailing in the war's final days without managing to sink a single ship. Also of intense interest was a stranger prize, the Type 17B, powered not by diesel and battery, but by hydrogen peroxide turbine that promised remarkable underwater speed at the cost of being notoriously dangerous to operate. Two of these so-called Walter boats, U-1406 and U-1407, had actually been scuttled by their own crews at Cuxhaven on 7th May, mere hours before the ceasefire actually came into force. Both were raised, patched up, and quietly handed to America and Britain, respectively, their unusual rubber-clad hulls judged too valuable to leave rusting at the bottom of a German harbor.
If you're enjoying this story, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep digging up forgotten corners of naval history like this one. It costs nothing, and it means more than you'd think. For the 116 boats that weren't retained, the Tripartite Commission's decision triggered Operation Deadlight, a Royal Navy plan to tow every unwanted U-boat roughly 100 miles northwest of Ireland to one of 3 designated patches of open ocean, codenamed XX, YY, and ZZ, and sink them in deep water where they could never be salvaged or become a hazard to shipping. It did not go entirely to plan. Many of the boats had spent the best part of a year moored, unmaintained, in exposed harbors, and when the operation finally got underway in the final days of November 1945, the North Atlantic delivered one savage winter gale after another. Fully 56 U-boats floundered before they ever reached the scuttling grounds, tow lines snapping in the swell, hulls simply giving way under the strain. Of those that did make it, the carefully planned demolition charges accounted for only 2 of them. Most were instead dispatched by naval gunfire, with smaller numbers finished off by aircraft or fired on by Royal Navy submarines for torpedo practice. The operation ran on into that final sinking on 12 February 1946, by which point Hitler's once feared U-boat arm had effectively ceased to exist as a physical fleet, dissolved not by a climactic battle, but by gunfire, gale, and an admiralty timetable. Individual fates along the way tell their own stories. U-889, a brand new boat barely 9 months out of her builder's yard in Bremen and never yet fired in anger, was intercepted roughly 250 kilometers southeast of Newfoundland on 10 May 1945. It took an RCAF Liberator 2 low passes, its crew arming depth charges and setting the bomb site, before her captain finally raised the black flag. She was escorted into Canadian waters, later sailed to the United States for trials, and was eventually scuttled off Florida in December 1947. U-190, which had sunk the Canadian warship HMCS Esquimalt at the cost of 44 lives only weeks earlier, surrendered to the frigate HMCS Victoriaville off Cape Race on 11th May, and was, for a brief and almost ceremonial spell, commissioned into the Royal Canadian Navy. For most ordinary U-boat crewmen, surrender simply meant captivity and interrogation. For a smaller number of engineers and technical officers, particularly those associated with the Type 21 and the Walter boats, it apparently meant something closer to recruitment, with a handful reportedly crossing over to assist Allied trials in the years that followed, a quieter, far less celebrated echo of the more famous transfer of German rocket scientists to America under Operation Paperclip. What each Allied power actually did with its allocated share said a great deal about its priorities. Britain, characteristically pragmatic and badly strapped for money and manpower in the austerity years that followed the war, moved quickly. Several of its 10 allocated boats were soon passed on long-term to loan to France and Canada, and by early 1946, only a small number remained under direct Royal Navy control for trials, mostly older Type VIC workhorses, along with one Type 21 and one Type 23 kept for comparison. Rather than maintain captured boats indefinitely, the Admiralty took a cleverer shortcut.
It converted one of its own submarines, HMS Seraph, to mimic the Type 21's underwater performance, allowing British anti-submarine forces to rehearse tactics against an opponent that, in any future war, would have been considerably harder to catch than anything they had faced before. Britain's most committed investment went instead into the captured Walter boat, recommissioned as HMS Meteorite, whose hydrogen peroxide trials ran until 1948 and convinced the Admiralty the technology offered genuine high-speed underwater endurance, enough to justify building two new experimental peroxide-fueled submarines, HMS Explorer and Excalibur, before the whole approach was eventually abandoned as impractical.
The United States took the opposite approach, extensive, sustained testing. Its two Type 21Xs, U-2513 and U-30008, were put through years of trials along the American eastern seaboard and in the Caribbean, assisted, by some accounts, by a handful of German engineers who chose to continue their work for their new employers rather than return home. The results fed directly into the Guppy program, which modernized dozens of older American fleet submarines with Type 21-inspired hull improvements and battery capacity, and into new-build classes such as the Tang. U-2513 was eventually expended as a gunnery target in 1951, and U-30008 was scrapped in 1956, by which point the American Navy had largely moved past the entire conventional submarine question, having launched the world's first nuclear-powered submarine, USS Nautilus, in 1954, and effectively leapfrogged the technology everyone else was still studying. The Soviet Union, by contrast, appears to have extracted the most lasting value of all. Its four allocated Type 21s, redesignated B-27 through B-30, remained in active trials until roughly 1955. Western intelligence assessments from the late 1940s, meanwhile, suspected the Soviets had acquired considerably more than their official share, having captured several of the factories and the Danzig assembly yard where Type 21 sections had originally been built, though the precise scale of that additional haul remains disputed to this day. Whatever the true number, the influence was unmistakable. The Soviet Navy's Project 613, known in the West as the Whiskey class, drew heavily on Type 21 principles and went on to become one of the most numerous submarine classes ever built, with well over 200 constructed, alongside the larger Project 611 Zulu class. Together, these boats formed the backbone of Soviet underwater power for decades and were later adapted to fire some of the Soviet Navy's earliest submarine-launched missiles. France, meanwhile, quietly got the longest single run of use out of any surrendered boat. U-2518, recommissioned as the Roland Morelot, served in the French Navy until 1967, more than 2 decades after the fleet that built her had ceased to exist. The human cost of all this is easy to lose beneath the technical detail. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in U-boats during the war, an estimated 28,000 did not survive it. Every crewman who hoisted a black flag in May 1945 and sailed into an Allied harbor was, statistically speaking, one of the lucky ones. The technological legacy, meanwhile, proved far longer-lived than the U-boats themselves. Virtually every significant conventional submarine built anywhere in the world between 1950 and 1990 owed something to the handful of Type 21s that survived to be studied. America's Tang class, the Soviet Whiskey and Zulu classes, Britain's Porpoise class, even, much later, China's Ming class. The single war patrol completed by U-2511 in 1945 changed nothing about the outcome of the conflict. The captured examples studied afterwards changed almost everything about what came next, quietly shaping the underwater half of the Cold War for the best part of half a century. Physical survivors are remarkably scarce. U-5050, captured at sea in 1944, rather than surrendered at war's end, a different story altogether, but a related one, sits today as a permanent exhibit at the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. U-995, one of the few standard boats to escape Operation Deadlight entirely, was transferred to Norway in 1948, served for years as the Norwegian Kaura, and was returned to Germany in 1965 to become a memorial at Lebow on the Baltic coast, where she remains today. U-2540, scuttled by her own crew in the chaos of 1945, was later raised and rebuilt as the Wilhelm Bauer, served for many years with West Germany's post-war navy, and eventually became a museum ship at Bremerhaven, quite possibly the only U-boat in history to go from wartime scuttling to active Cold War service and finally to a museum berth. The rest of the 116 Deadlight boats remain where they were sent, scattered across the seabed roughly 100 miles northwest of Ireland, periodically located and surveyed by maritime archaeologists in the decades since, their pre-1945 steel untouched by the radioactive trace elements that have coated almost everything manufactured since the first nuclear tests, occasionally eyed, though never seriously exploited, for use in scientific instruments sensitive enough to need metal with no background radiation at all.
Which brings us back to that gray morning in February 1946 and U-3514 slipping under for the final time. It would be satisfying to say the U-boat arm went out with some kind of dignity, a last duel, a final desperate action against impossible odds, the sort of ending the men who designed and crewed these boats might once have imagined for themselves. It did not. It went out the way almost everything administrative goes out, slowly, then all at once, on someone else's schedule, in weather nobody had planned for, sunk as often by gunfire as by the demolition charges that were meant to do the job properly. Karl Dönitz had ordered his entire fleet scuttled in early May to deny it to the men who had beaten him. In the most literal sense, the Allies finished that order for him 9 months later, far more thoroughly and entirely on their own terms. Of the more than 1,000 U-boats that had at various points made up the most feared submarine force the world had ever seen, the war itself had already claimed the overwhelming majority by the time Germany surrendered. Of what remained, Deadlight claimed all but a handful more. Only 2 would ever again be seen by the public as anything other than scrap or a wreck on a chart. One captured in battle and preserved in Chicago, one that slipped through the entire process by being lent to a neutral navy at exactly the right moment, and now stands quietly on the German coast she once sailed from. Everything else, the hulls, the steel, the crews themselves, was either lost to the war or lost to the peace that followed it. But the ideas inside those hulls were never sunk at all. The battery capacity, the underwater speed, the schnorkel that let a submarine breathe without showing itself, all of it surfaced again within a decade, in new boats, under new flags, in navies that would spend the next 40 years pointed at one another across an ocean that had, not so long before, belonged to a single defeated power. Germany's U-boats did not survive the peace. The submarine, as Germany had reinvented it in 1945, very much did.
Augsburg, Bavaria, 0614 hours, 11 March 1943. The night frost hasn't burned off the tarmac yet, and a 26-year-old junior production engineer named Anton Rail is on his knees under the belly of a Bf-109 G4, torque wrench in hand, telling a decorated test pilot that the entire Luftwaffe fighter procurement office is wrong about a piece of aluminum 2 feet long. Rail weighs 61 kilograms, wears glasses held together at the hinge with wire, and has never flown anything in his life beyond an unmotorized glider. He has a diploma from a technical college in Kempten that nobody in this hangar has heard of. 3 months earlier, he was assembling landing gear struts on the line, one of 40 men doing identical work in a shed that smelled permanently of grease and cold metal. What nobody standing on that tarmac knows, not the test pilot, not the Messerschmitt engineering board, not the Luftwaffe's own inspectorate, is that the 4 blades of narrow-cored aluminum bolted to every 109 in the fighting inventory are quietly costing German pilots an altitude advantage that will decide whether the Bf 109 can still fight the P-51 and P-38 on even terms above 7,000 meters. Rail thinks he knows why. Nobody wants to hear it. Then he does something that gets him nearly court-martialed. Since 1937, Luftwaffe propeller doctrine has rested on one settled principle, endorsed by the RLM's own technical office under the successors to Oberst Ernst Udet. Narrow-chord, high RPM propellers deliver the best compromise between climb rate and top speed for an interceptor airframe. The VDM Propeller Works in Frankfurt, the primary supplier for the 109's variable pitch units, has built this doctrine into every production run since the Bf 109E. Junkers's own engine test division at Dessau ran comparative trials in the winter of 1940 and concluded, in a report that carried the full weight of the RLM's endorsement, that broader blades above a chord ratio of 0.14 produced unacceptable tip vortex losses above 6,000 meters, the exact altitude band where Allied escort fighters now flew their sweeps. The math had been done twice by men with doctorates. The case was closed and had been closed for 3 years. By late 1942, that closed case was costing lives at a rate nobody in Berlin wanted printed on paper. In the 7 days of 4 to 10 November, Luftwaffe fighter wings operating out of Sicily and southern France recorded a 23% loss rate against high-altitude bomber escort sweeps, nearly triple the loss rate logged by the same units 8 months earlier, in March. Engine performance reports from Jagdgeschwader 53 read almost identically week to week. 109s bounced from above by P-38 Lightnings, and the newer Spitfire Mark 9s simply couldn't outclimb or match turn radius above 7,000 meters. The DB605 engine had the horsepower on paper, 1,475 PS at takeoff boost, rising to 1,800 PS with emergency methanol water injection. But pilots kept filing the same complaint in different words. The aircraft ran out of air exactly where the fight was happening. Squadron adjutants started attaching casualty photographs to the weekly reports, a practice that hadn't existed the previous winter because numbers alone weren't moving procurement fast enough. Anton Rail grew up outside Kempten in the Allgäu, the son of a sawmill foreman who worked 6 days a week cutting spruce for construction timber and had no money to send his son to a real university. Anton apprenticed instead, at 14, in a small precision machining shop that made replacement parts for farm equipment and later textile looms. Work that demanded patience with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter long, before anyone taught him the word tolerance formally. In his spare hours as a teenager, he'd taken up competitive gliding out of a grass airstrip near Kempten, flying unmotorized sailplanes entirely dependent on reading airflow with your hands and the seat of your trousers, because a glider pilot who guessed wrong about thermal lift at 2,000 meters simply fell out of the sky with no engine to save him. He'd spent 4 years learning by feel rather than by formula exactly how a wing surface behaved as air thinned and cooled with altitude. Nobody at Messerschmitt considered glider experience a qualification worth listing on a personnel file. It was a hobby for boys who couldn't afford flight school, filed somewhere below plays accordion in the eyes of the engineering board. Augsburg, Bavaria. 0614 hours, 11 March 1943. The night frost hasn't burned off the tarmac yet, and a 26-year-old junior production engineer named Anton Rail is on his knees under the belly of a Bf-109 G4, torque wrench in hand, telling a decorated test pilot that the entire Luftwaffe fighter procurement office is wrong about a piece of aluminum 2 feet long. Rail weighs 61 kilograms, wears glasses held together at the hinge with wire, and has never flown anything in his life beyond an unmotorized glider. He has a diploma from a technical college in Kempten that nobody in this hangar has heard of. 3 months earlier, he was assembling landing gear struts on the line, one of 40 men doing identical work in a shed that smelled permanently of grease and cold metal. What nobody standing on that tarmac knows, not the test pilot, not the Messerschmitt engineering board, not the Luftwaffe's own inspectorate, is that the 4 blades of narrow-cored aluminum bolted to every 109 in the fighting inventory are quietly costing German pilots an altitude advantage that will decide whether the Bf-109 can still fight the P-51 and P-38 on even terms above 7,000 meters. Rail thinks he knows why. Nobody wants to hear it. Then he does something that gets him nearly court-martialed. Since 1937, Luftwaffe propeller doctrine has rested on one settled principle, endorsed by the RLM's own technical office under the successors to Oberst Ernst Udet. Narrow-chord, high RPM propellers deliver the best compromise between climb rate and top speed for an interceptor airframe. The VDM Propeller Works in Frankfurt, the primary supplier for the 109's variable pitch units, has built this doctrine into every production run since the Bf-109E. Junkers's own engine test division at Dessau ran comparative trials in the winter of 1940 and concluded, in a report that carried the full weight of the RLM's endorsement, that broader blades above a chord ratio of 0.14 produced unacceptable tip vortex losses above 6,000 meters, the exact altitude band where Allied escort fighters now flew their sweeps. The math had been done twice by men with doctorates. The case was closed and had been closed for 3 years. By late 1942, that closed case was costing lives at a rate nobody in Berlin wanted printed on paper. In the 7 days of 4 to 10 November, Luftwaffe fighter wings operating out of Sicily and southern France recorded a 23% loss rate against high-altitude bomber escort sweeps, nearly triple the loss rate logged by the same units 8 months earlier, in March. Engine performance reports from Jagdgeschwader 53 read almost identically week to week. 109s bounced from above by P-38 Lightnings, and the newer Spitfire Mark 9s simply couldn't outclimb or match turn radius above 7,000 meters. The DB605 engine had the horsepower on paper, 1,475 PS at takeoff boost, rising to 1,800 PS with emergency methanol water injection. But pilots kept filing the same complaint in different words. The aircraft ran out of air exactly where the fight was happening. Squadron adjutants started attaching casualty photographs to the weekly reports, a practice that hadn't existed the previous winter because numbers alone weren't moving procurement fast enough. Anton Rail grew up outside Kempten in the Allgäu, the son of a sawmill foreman who worked 6 days a week cutting spruce for construction timber and had no money to send his son to a real university. Anton apprenticed instead, at 14, in a small precision machining shop that made replacement parts for farm equipment and later textile looms. Work that demanded patience with tolerances measured in fractions of a millimeter long, before anyone taught him the word tolerance formally. In his spare hours as a teenager, he'd taken up competitive gliding out of a grass airstrip near Kempton, flying unmotorized sailplanes entirely dependent on reading airflow with your hands and the seat of your trousers, because a glider pilot who guessed wrong about thermal lift at 2,000 meters simply fell out of the sky with no engine to save him. He'd spent 4 years learning by feel rather than by formula exactly how a wing surface behaved as air thinned and cooled with altitude. Nobody at Messerschmitt considered glider experience a qualification worth listing on a personnel file. It was a hobby for boys who couldn't afford flight school, filed somewhere below plays accordion in the eyes of the engineering board. The insight came on an ordinary Tuesday in late February 1943, 3 weeks before the hangar confrontation. Rel had been reassigned as a kind of quiet demotion after a dispute with a floor supervisor over a struts inspection to cataloging recovered propeller blades from crash-landed and battle-damaged aircraft for the metallurgy office, a menial task nobody senior wanted, done in a cold salvage yard behind the main works with a caliper, a notebook, and a stack of tags. Rel noticed something the metallurgists hadn't flagged. Blades recovered from aircraft that had been flying above 7,000 meters showed a specific, repeated erosion pattern on the outer 30 centimeters, not combat damage, not the expected leading-edge pitting from grit and debris, but a fine, feathery, cavitation-like scarring that matched almost exactly a pattern he remembered from wingtip vortex bleed on his own glider in cold, thin mountain air over the Algo at altitude. The official doctrine said whiter blades caused unacceptable tip losses above 6,000 meters. Rel, kneeling in gravel with a caliper and a stub of pencil, began to suspect something closer to the opposite. The blades weren't wide enough anywhere. They were the wrong shape entirely, narrow at precisely the point where the thinning air demanded the most surface area to bite into it, and the 1940 doctrine had measured the wrong failure mode. He didn't say anything to anyone for 11 days. He went back twice more to the salvage yard on his own time in the evenings, measuring blade after blade, building a small table of numbers in a notebook he kept in his coat pocket. Only when the pattern held across 9 separate recovered blades from 3 different squadrons did he trust it enough to act on it. Rel's first attempt was unauthorized and almost went nowhere, using scrap aluminum and a borrowed grinding jig after hours with a sympathetic ground crew sergeant named Willie Haas standing watch at the shed door. Rel reshaped a single condemned propeller blade, widening the outer third by 40 millimeters at the tip while tapering the root to compensate for the added mass, and mounted it on a static test rig normally reserved for engine break-in runs, alongside 3 standard blades left unmodified to preserve rotational balance as closely as he could manage by eye. At 2,700 RPM and a simulated 7,000-meter density altitude, achieved crudely with a modified intake shroud restricting airflow to the test cell, the reshaped blade's sector showed an 8% increase in simulated thrust efficiency over the standard VDM geometry, measured on a torque arm dynamometer Haas had rigged from a truck brake drum. It wasn't proof of anything that would satisfy an engineering board. It was a single modified blade among 3 standard ones on an unbalanced test article nobody sane would put in the air, but it was enough of a number, repeated across 3 test runs on 3 separate nights, that Rel couldn't let it go. He took the data to the weekly engineering review, uninvited, and it went badly. Herr Rel, Diploming engineer Werner Falkenrath, chief of the propeller integration office, didn't look up from the report Rel had typed himself on a borrowed machine. You are aware that VDM's own aerodynamicists, men with doctorates from Göttingen, spent 11 months on this exact chord geometry question in 1940 with access to a proper wind tunnel and instrumentation you do not have. I've read the report, Herr Falkenrath. I think the test parameters missed the altitude band where the failure actually occurred. "You think." That was Hauptmann Georg Bruckner, the Luftwaffe liaison officer, a compact man who had flown fighters in Spain and did not suffer amateur theorizing. The chord width assumes a uniform increase in chord width across the whole blade. I didn't increase the whole blade, only the outer third, where the density altitude problem actually concentrates. The 1940 study didn't test that specific geometry. Enough! A third voice, Ober-Engineer Klaus Vogt, the most senior man in the room, a heavy-sought veteran of propeller design going back to the 1920s, who had personally signed off on 3 prior generations of Messerschmitt propeller specifications. This is not a discussion for a fitter, no matter how clever, with a grinding wheel and a caliper. The chord width question is settled science, settled by men whose names you have read on the cover pages of the reports you claim to have studied. Rell was formally reprimanded for unauthorized use of shop equipment and condemned material, given a written warning that went into his personnel file, and told the matter was closed. His test rig data was filed unsigned in a drawer in Falkenrath's office, and for 11 days it looked as though that would be the end of it. The unexpected ally arrived on the 12th day, and he came from the last place Rail expected, the DB-605 Engine Test Division rather than the propeller office at all. Dr. Friedrich Allman, a senior propulsion engineer with 15 years at Daimler-Benz, had heard about the incident through a metallurgy colleague who thought the story was amusing and requested Rail's raw test numbers out of professional curiosity rather than sympathy. Allman ran his own recalculation using Daimler's altitude chamber data, pressure and temperature curves gathered from actual high-altitude engine testing rather than VDM's sea-level wind tunnel assumptions, and found something that made him sit at his desk for a long time before he acted on it. The 1940 Juncker study had used compressibility coefficients that held accurately below 5,000 meters but diverged sharply above it. Above that altitude, in the exact band where German fighters were now losing at an accelerating rate, the old math simply did not describe the airflow correctly. It wasn't that VDM's engineers had been careless, it was that nobody had needed the number to be right above 6,000 meters in 1940, because in 1940 nobody was fighting up there. Herr Falkenrath, Allman said at the follow-up review he'd requested personally, "I've checked the boys' numbers against our own altitude chamber logs from the DB-605 test program. He's not wrong about where the doctrine breaks down. He may very well be wrong about the specific fix. I make no claim on that yet. But he is not wrong about the problem, and I would be careful about dismissing a correct diagnosis simply because the diagnostician has the wrong rank." It bought Rail a conditional authorization, delivered by Vogt with visible and undisguised reluctance, one prototype set of 4 matched, properly engineered blades, built to Rail's tip geometry, but under Allman's structural sign-off and full liability, to be static tested exhaustively and then flown, if it survived that, by a single test pilot, Oberleutnant Hans Dietrich Mohl, a cautious, exacting flyer with 340 combat hours and a reputation for filing the driest, most useless-to-propaganda after-action reports in the wing, precisely because he never exaggerated anything. "You have until the 15th of April, Vogt said, sliding a single typed page across the table without ceremony. 5 weeks. If the blades don't hold at rated RPM through a full altitude climb profile without incident, this is finished, and you go back to landing struts permanently, and I do not want to hear your name in this building again." The refinement took every one of those 5 weeks and very nearly ran past them. Rail and Allman worked the geometry by hand. No wind tunnel time was available on any reasonable schedule, so calculations were done with slide rules, trigonometric tables, and in Rail's case, penciled directly onto the backs of cigarette packets during night shifts, when the drafting office was empty and he could work without an audience. The final tip profile widened the outer 35 centimeters of each blade by 38 millimeters, tapered from a root chord of 21 centimeters down through a modified elliptical outer section, with the leading edge angle increased by 2.5 degrees at the tip station to compensate for the added mass moment shifting the blade's center of pressure outward. Balance tolerance across the four-blade set had to be held to within 4 grams, checked and rechecked on a knife-edge balance rig 11 separate times, with 2 full blade sets scrapped entirely when they came in at 6 and 9 grams out of tolerance respectively, before Vogt would authorize static spin testing at all. Static testing on April 2nd cleared the blades to 2,800 RPM with no detectable flutter across a 2-hour sustained run, monitored by Allman with a stethoscope-like listening rod pressed against the test stand housing, an old-fashioned method he trusted more than the vibration gauges. On April 9th, Moll flew the first confirmed test, a scripted climb profile from Augsburg to 8,200 meters, flown twice, once on a standard blade G4 for direct comparison, and once on the modified prototype, on the same morning in nearly identical air temperature and wind conditions. The results, logged by Moll in his characteristically flat prose, time to altitude improved by 47 seconds over the standard blade aircraft, and the modified 109 still had positive control response and usable lift margin in a hard turn at 7,600 meters, an altitude where every 109 he had personally flown that winter had gone soft and mushy on the stick, bleeding energy in a turn instead of holding it. The complication came fast, faster than anyone had planned. Word of the prototype's climb numbers reached the fighter wings through informal channels before production capacity could follow through official ones, and VDM's Frankfurt plant, still fully committed to the old tooling and old contracts, could produce only 6 matched sets a week using the manual finishing process Allman's shop had improvised. Worse, on April 21st, a modified blade suffered a stress fracture during a training climb near Augsburg. Not a design failure, investigation showed after 3 days of metallurgical analysis, but a batch of aluminium stock with undocumented impurities from a rushed wartime supplier substitution that nobody had flagged on the incoming materials sheet. The whole program was one bad headline, one dead pilot away from outright cancellation. Rail was for about a week the most unpopular man at the Augsburg works, quietly blamed by production planners for a supply chain problem that was never his to solve, and Falkenrath came within a single signature of shutting the entire prototype line down. The countermeasure that saved it was Rail's own idea, and it came from his Milltown background rather than his engineering training. Instead of demanding new, dedicated tooling from VDM, a request that would have taken 4 to 6 months to fulfill even under wartime priority, he proposed hand-selecting and X-ray inspecting existing aluminum stock already sitting in the Augsburg warehouse from 3 approved suppliers, sorting it batch by batch for the specific alloy purity the new tip geometry required, and running 2 full shifts of manual finishing on the outer tip sections rather than waiting on automated tooling that didn't exist yet. It was slower per unit and cost considerably more in skilled labor hours. It also meant properly vetted blades could begin shipping to squadrons within 2 weeks instead of within 4 months, and it sidestepped the supplier contamination problem entirely by inspecting every single blade before it left the shop floor. The climax came on 3 June 1943 over the Gulf of Genoa, in weather Moll later described as clear to the horizon in every direction, which is not always a mercy. A flight of 4 modified Bf-109 G6s from JG-53, including Moll's own aircraft, intercepted a formation of B-17s escorted by P-38 Lightnings at 7,900 meters, precisely the altitude band where every prior 109 sortie that spring had failed to hold an advantage against the same aircraft type. Moll's after-action report, filed at 14:42 hours in his usual unadorned procedural style, recorded the engagement without embellishment: an initial bounce from 8,400 meters, a diving pass through the P-38 screen at an indicated 620 kilometers per hour, and, critically, the line Aumann would later underline in his own copy, a sustained climbing turn back to altitude that the escort fighters simply could not follow, bleeding off their own energy trying. 2 P-38s were claimed destroyed in that engagement. One modified 109 sustained cannon fire damage to its rudder and horizontal stabilizer and returned to base on a straight-line descent, and for the first time in the unit's log since the previous November, every single aircraft that took off that morning returned to Augsburg's forward strip that afternoon. The statistical vindication built steadily over the following 10 weeks, tracked in the same weekly reports that had once carried casualty photographs. JG-53's loss rate against high-altitude escort engagements fell from the November 1942 peak of 23% down to 9% by the second week of July and to 6% by mid-August, even as Allied sortie numbers in the theater increased month over month rather than declining. Fuel consumption at altitude rose slightly under the modified geometry, a trade-off Aumann had flagged from the very beginning of the program and never hid from anyone, but pilots simply stopped filing the "runs out of air" complaint in their debriefs, and squadron adjutants noticed the change before anyone in Berlin did. An intercepted Allied intelligence summary, recovered from a downed reconnaissance aircraft that September, noted with evident concern that German fighters in the Mediterranean theater were exhibiting altered high-altitude performance characteristics inconsistent with prior technical assessments of the Bf-109 airframe, and recommended revised combat doctrine for Allied escort fighters operating above 7,000 meters, a direct, if anonymous, acknowledgement from the other side that something fundamental had changed. A captured Luftwaffe maintenance log from the same period, recovered after the war, included a handwritten margin note from an unnamed ground crew chief, almost an afterthought scrawled beside a parts inventory. The men had started calling the modified units rails blades, and nobody argued about them anymore. By October 1943, the modified blade geometry had spread beyond JG-53 to elements of JG-27 and JG-3, carried theater to theater less by formal directive than by squadron engineering officers requesting the specification directly from Augsburg once word got around. Messerschmitt's own production division quietly revised its standard propeller specification for late-model G6 and G14 variants that winter, without ever formally crediting the change to the junior engineer whose unauthorized shed experiment had started it. Anton Rall was never promoted beyond senior production engineer, and he never asked to be. When Falkenrath, months later, in what seemed to be a genuine, if belated attempt at making amends, offered him a transfer to the main design office with a formal commendation attached to his file, Rall declined it without much apparent conflict. "I'd rather stay near the blades," he reportedly told a colleague over a meal in the works canteen. "I understand them. I don't understand committees, and I don't think I ever will, and I've made my peace with that." He remained at the Augsburg works in a technical capacity through the end of the war, keeping largely to himself, and in a brief piece of correspondence in 1961 to an aviation historian cataloging German wartime propeller development, he wrote a single paragraph that the historian later quoted in full. "I was not clever. I had only spent enough hours in a glider, cold and without instruments, to feel what the air was doing at altitude, which is a different kind of knowledge than the kind they teach in universities, and it took me a long time to understand that both kinds are real." He died in 1974, at age 57, in Kempton, largely unrecognized outside a small circle of post-war aviation engineers who had followed the West German aircraft industry, where variable camber, altitude-adapted propeller and rotor blade design, the direct technical descendant of Rahl's wartime tip modification, became standard engineering practice in turboprop and early helicopter rotor design through the 1950s and into the 1960s, taught in textbooks that never once mentioned his name. The lesson sits plainly in the record, without needing much decoration. The men who wrote the doctrine had the mathematics, the credentials, and the wind tunnel. The man who fixed it had 4 years of feeling cold, thin air move under a glider's wing with no instruments to tell him what his hands already knew. Expertise and proximity to the problem are not always the same thing, and on this occasion, the second one mattered more than the first. Somewhere in a salvage yard outside Augsburg in late February 1943, a fitter with a wire-mended pair of glasses is still on his knees in the gravel, turning a condemned propeller blade over in his hands, about to notice something nobody else had thought to look for.
October 1st, 1940, Bridgeport, Connecticut. A single prototype fighter climbs away from the Vogt-Sikorsky Airfield at Stratford, its 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney engine turning just over 2,600 RPM at full throttle. At the controls is Lyman Bullard, Vogt's chief test pilot, 9 years into a career that has never put him in a machine like this one. Within minutes, he pushes the aircraft into level flight and the airspeed indicator climbs past 400 miles per hour, 644 kilometers per hour. No single-engine American fighter has ever done that before. 3 months earlier, this exact airframe was lying inverted in a stand of trees on a golf course, its tail torn open and a wing ripped away, written off by more than one engineer who saw it. What almost nobody watching this flight from the ground knows is that the aircraft's strangest feature, a wing that drops down sharply from the fuselage and then bends back up toward the tip, like an inverted seagull, wasn't the product of a committee, a wind tunnel study, or a stress calculation nobody could argue with. It came from one man asking an almost embarrassingly simple question in a design meeting 2 years earlier. A question so plain that 6 other qualified engineers in that same room could have asked it first and hadn't. Nobody expected it to become the answer that got a fighter off a golf course and past 400 miles an hour inside the same year. By 1938, the U.S. Navy's requirement was blunt: build a carrier fighter faster than anything currently flying with the highest possible rate of climb, built around the largest and most powerful air-cooled engine the Bureau of Aeronautics could offer, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder twin-row radial rated at up to 2,000 horsepower. Every naval fighter design of the period followed the same doctrine: mount the engine, mount a propeller sized to absorb its power, and build a conventional low or mid-set wing with landing gear long enough to keep that propeller off the ground. It had worked for a decade. Nobody at Vogt, at Grumman, or at the Bureau saw reason it wouldn't keep working. The problem was the propeller itself. To absorb 2,000 horsepower without simply shredding the air in front of it, the design team, led by Chief Engineer Rex Beazle, with Project Engineer Frank Albright, aerodynamicist Alfred Sabila, and propulsion engineer James Shoemaker, specified a 3-blade Hamilton Standard hydromatic unit spanning 4.01 meters, 13 feet 1 inch, among the largest ever fitted to a single-engine fighter. A propeller that size needs roughly 46 centimeters, 18 inches of ground clearance at the tip through a full oleocompression stroke. On a conventional straight wing, that meant landing gear legs long enough to look almost stilt-like. Fine for a runway at Bridgeport, potentially disastrous folded onto an undercarriage built to absorb the vertical impact of a carrier landing, typically 3 to 4 times the loads of a land strike. The requirement itself had come down from the Bureau of Aeronautics on February 1, 1938, as a formal request for proposals to every major American airframe manufacturer. Vought responded in April with two competing designs of its own. By June, the version built around the R2800 had won outright. Less than a year separated that win from a flying prototype, a pace that left the engineering team very little room to iterate on the undercarriage problem once it surfaced. Beazle's team tried the straight wing layout first, the way engineering teams tend to try the obvious approach first. It produced landing gear struts approaching 2.1 meters, 7 feet, fully extended. Tall, narrow-tracked, and structurally marginal for repeated carrier arrests at sink rates of 3 to 4 meters per second. Early mock-up reviews in late 1938 flagged the undercarriage as the design's weakest link before a single prototype had left the ground. Rex Beisel was 45 years old in 1938, already one of the most experienced fighter designers in American naval aviation. He'd worked on the Curtiss TS-1 2 decades earlier, one of the Navy's first purpose-built shipboard fighters, and had spent the years since moving between Curtiss and Vought on a string of naval airframes that never became famous the way the Corsair eventually would. Inside Vought, he had a reputation as a man who solved problems on paper before anyone touched the rivet gun, the kind of engineer other engineers deferred to on undercarriage and structural questions specifically because he rarely proposed anything flashy. He wasn't a maverick, and the eventual solution to the Corsair's landing gear problem didn't come from an outsider bucking the establishment. It came from Beisel himself, mid-meeting, thinking out loud. According to Sibylla's own account of the session, given decades later, Beisel turned to the group and asked why they didn't put a bend in the wing at the point where the landing gear attached, drop the wing down to shorten the strut, then angle it back up to the tip to keep the wing area and dihedral the aerodynamics required. It was the kind of question junior engineers get told not to ask in a room full of specialists, because it sounds too simple to be the missing piece. In this case, it was. The inverted gull wing did three things at once. It let the wing meet the fuselage at a structurally efficient right angle instead of a shallow, stress-concentrated one. It shortened the landing gear leg by roughly 60 centimeters or 2 feet without sacrificing propeller clearance. And it opened up the wing roots for large oil cooler intakes tucked directly against the engine, solving a cooling problem for the big double wasp that a straight wing would have made harder, not easier. Vought built a dedicated jig to fabricate the wing center section and lower fuselage as a single unit, a manufacturing decision that added weeks to tooling, but kept the airframe's stiffness where the bend needed it most. The gull wing carrying a second, quieter benefit that almost never makes it into the popular account. Tucking the oil coolers into those wing root intakes immediately outboard of the fuselage and close to the engine shortened the plumbing runs for coolant and oil lines by a meaningful margin over a conventional layout, cutting both weight and the chance of a battle-damaged line starving the engine on the return leg home. It also let the design team push the 6-gun armament, 3.50 caliber Brownings per wing, each with 400 rounds, outboard of the landing gear bays entirely, clear of the folding mechanism needed to fit the aircraft onto a carrier's below-deck elevators. None of that was the original goal. It fell out of solving the undercarriage problem, the way a good structural fix in one place tends to simplify 3 others nobody asked about. None of this solved every problem, and the team knew it going in. The long nose required to balance the enormous engine and that 4-meter propeller would sit the pilot roughly 3 meters back from the leading edge with almost no forward view over the cowling on a nose-up carrier approach. Nobody in the room in 1938 had an answer for that yet. It would take 4 more years, a rejected Navy carrier qualification, and an entirely different Air Force to solve it. The gull wing decision wasn't free. Building the wing center section and lower fuselage as a single jig-formed unit added roughly 6 to 8 weeks to initial tooling, by the engineering team's own later estimates, at a moment when the Bureau of Aeronautics was pressing for a flying prototype as quickly as possible. Beisel accepted the delay rather than compromise the structure, on the reasoning that a wing built in 2 separately jigged pieces bolted together at the root would introduce exactly the kind of stress riser weak point the whole redesign design existed to eliminate. It was a trade the Bureau signed off on without much argument, largely because the alternative, the original straight-wing undercarriage, hadn't survived its own paper review. The prototype, designated XF4U-1, was completed in early 1940 after a full-scale mock-up review and wind tunnel testing through 1939. On May 29, 1940, Bullard took it up for its maiden flight from Bridgeport Municipal Airport. He landed reporting excessive vibration through the airframe at cruise power. Not a crisis, but not nothing, and it went straight into the test log for the engineering team to chase down. 6 weeks later, on July 11, 1940, a second Vought test pilot, 27-year-old Boone Guyton, was flying the prototype on a high-speed test run when deteriorating weather and a dwindling fuel state left him unable to raise Bridgeport or any other field on the radio. He put the aircraft down on a golf course in Norwich, Connecticut, on wet grass. It skidded into a tree line and rolled, tearing off part of the tail structure and a wing. Guyton walked away unhurt. The airframe looked, by more than one account, beyond saving. Vought's structural team disagreed, and the aircraft was back in the air by September, a 2-month setback, not a canceled program. Then, on 1 October 1940, with a strengthened R-2800 producing roughly 2,000 horsepower, Bullard took the repaired prototype to just over 400 miles per hour in level flight, 644 kilometers per hour, the first U.S. single-engine fighter ever recorded doing so. Formal Navy acceptance trials opened in February 1941. Full-power dive testing during this period took the prototype to recorded speeds as high as 550 miles per hour, 886 kilometers per hour, a figure that damaged control surfaces and access panels on at least one run, and on another contributed to an engine failure, forcing the Bureau to relax its original spin recovery standards for the type, rather than demand a wing incapable of ever approaching those loads. On 30 June 1941, the Bureau of Aeronautics signed an initial production order for 584 aircraft under the name Corsair, recycling the name of an earlier Vought observation biplane from the 1920s. The first production F4U-1 flew on 24 June 1942, again with Guyton at the controls, roughly 4 years after Beisel first sketched the wing that made the airframe possible. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel exists to separate what actually happened in this war from the version that gets repeated because it sounds better. So if that's useful to you, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs nothing. Carrier qualification trials in 1942 confirmed what the 1938 mock-up review had already half predicted about the nose, and added new problems nobody had fully modeled. The long cowling needed to balance that 4-meter propeller and the bulk of the R-2800 ahead of the cockpit, block the pilot's view of the deck on a standard straight-in approach, on some estimates leaving well under 10 degrees of visible deck angle in the final seconds before touchdown, against the carrier landing pattern that assumed continuous visual contact with the landing signal officer. The undercarriage, even shortened by the gull wing bend, remained stiff enough to induce a bounce on touchdown if the aircraft arrived even slightly fast or level, rather than in the correct nose-high attitude, and an unpredictable stall could drop a wing in the groove with almost no warning margin, sometimes with fewer than 2 seconds between the first buffet and full departure from controlled flight. Landing signal officers on at least 2 evaluation carriers logged the F4U-1 as unsuitable for fleet operations. The U.S. Navy's own Board of Inspection agreed, and by the end of 1942, the Corsair had been provisionally rejected for carrier duty. An aircraft designed from its first pencil line around the Navy carrier requirement, now flying its entire war from runways instead. It went to war anyway, just not from a flight deck. The first Corsairs reached Marine Fighting Squadron VMF-124 in the Solomon Islands in February 1943, flying land-based out of Guadalcanal, where deck qualification didn't matter and the aircraft's speed and firepower did. Ground crews fitted their own field modifications almost immediately. wheel pants for the rough coral strips, tail hooks salvaged for the rare occasions a corsair did need to catch a wire ashore, and extra internal fuel capacity squeezed in wherever it would fit, none of it specified by Vought or the Bureau of Aeronautics, all of it driven by mechanics solving the problem in front of them the same way Beissel's team had 4 years ago. Armed with 6.5 caliber Browning machine guns at 400 rounds per gun, and able to carry up to roughly 1,800 kilograms, 4,000 pounds of bombs and rockets on later variants, the Corsair became the Marine Corps' primary fighter-bomber for the rest of the Pacific campaign. Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington took command of VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, on September 7, 1943. In under 5 months of combat, he was credited with 28 enemy aircraft destroyed before being shot down over Rabaul on January 3, 1944, and spending the remainder of the war as a prisoner. Japanese ground troops under Corsair strikes reportedly gave the aircraft a nickname that stuck, Whistling Death, a reference to the high-pitched sounds produced by air moving through those wing root oil cooler intakes during a dive. By VJ Day, September 2, 1945, the Navy credited Corsair pilots with 2,140 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, against 189 Corsairs lost in air combat, and a further 1,435 lost to non-combat accidents, a kill ratio commonly cited at around 11-1. Though the exact figure is disputed among historians, and depends heavily on which claims and which time periods are counted. From 30 February 1943 onward, Navy and Marine pilots flew 64,051 operational sorties in the type, the overwhelming majority, 54,470, from land runways rather than carrier decks, which tells its own story about how the aircraft actually spent the war. One of the odder footnotes to that combat record involves a man with no military rank at all. Charles Lindbergh, blackballed from an Army Air Forces commission over his pre-war opposition to U.S. involvement in the European War, ended up flying unofficial combat sorties with Marine Air Group 31 in the Pacific through 1944, ostensibly as a technical consultant. In May and June, he flew missions from Green Island and Imerau. By September, he was pushing the F-4U-1D's bomb-carrying limits well past anything in the aircraft's manual, dropping 3 450-kilogram, 1,000-pound bombs on Watsi Atoll on September 3rd, a type's first 900-kilogram, 2,000-pound bomb on the same atoll on September 8th, and a mixed load of 1 900-kilogram and 2 450-kilogram bombs 5 days after that. Over 1,800 kilograms, 4,000 pounds in a single sortie, roughly half a B-17's typical load, off a single-engine fighter. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm, operating under different risk tolerances and needing carrier fighters immediately, took Lend-Lease Corsairs and solved the visibility problem the U.S. Navy hadn't cracked. A curved, continuously banked final approach that kept the flight deck in the pilot's peripheral view right up to touchdown, instead of trying to see over a blocked nose on a straight-in run. Fleet Air Arm ground crews made their own hardware adjustment too, clipping roughly 20 centimeters, 8 inches, off each wingtip so the folded Corsair would clear the lower deck heights common on British carriers, a modification that, as a side effect, marginally improved the aircraft's roll rate. British squadrons qualified the F-4U for carrier operations years before the U.S. Navy formally did the same, flying it operationally from Royal Navy decks from 1943 onward. It's a detail American accounts of the Corsair often skip past. The aircraft's own home service didn't fully solve its worst design flaw. An Allied air arm did, using a flying technique and a pair of hacksaws rather than a hardware redesign from Vought. The airframe kept evolving through the middle of the war. The F-4U-1D, entering production in early 1944, added underwing rocket and bomb racks and water injection, boosting top speed to around 425 miles per hour, or 684 kilometers per hour, at 6,100 meters, or 20,000 feet. The F-4U-4, reaching squadrons in the war's final 6 months, pushed the 2,100 horsepower engine with water alcohol injection to roughly 2,450 horsepower on demand, for a top speed near 446 miles per hour, or 718 kilometers per hour, faster in that configuration than a contemporary P-51 Mustang. A parallel line, the Goodyear-built F-2G Super Corsair, fitted an entirely different 28-cylinder, 4-row Pratt & Whitney R4360 engine, rated near 3,000 horsepower, intended as a low-altitude interceptor against kamikaze attacks. Only a handful were completed, reaching 431 miles per hour at altitude and 399 miles per hour at sea level. None of the wartime variants reached 470 miles per hour. That figure belongs to the F-4U-5, a post-war development that entered service from 1946 with a further refined R-2800 and a 2-stage, 2-speed supercharger, giving it markedly better high-altitude performance than any wartime Corsair. The fastest production version of the airframe ever built, but one that arrived roughly a year after the Japanese surrender and never fired a shot in the Second World War. It's a distinction worth being precise about, because it's easy for the popular figure, often quoted without a variant attached, to get retroactively applied to the wartime aircraft that actually fought at Guadalcanal and Rabaul, when the machine those pilots flew topped out closer to 400 to 425 miles per hour, depending on altitude and boost setting. The 470 mile per hour Corsair is real. It's simply a different aircraft, built for a different war, 5 to 6 years after Basil's original bend in the wing first left the ground. Production ramped unevenly through the middle years of the war. The first 9 production F-4U-1s were accepted in July and August 1942. By November 1943, the monthly rate had passed 200 units, and it peaked in May 1944 at 596 aircraft across 3 manufacturers in a single month. 254 built by Vought itself, 220 by Goodyear under the designation FG-1, and 122 by Brewster as the F-3A. Brewster's production quality became enough of a problem that the U.S. government shut the contract down entirely by July 1944, reassigning its share of Corsair output to the remaining 2 builders. In the war's final year alone, 3,577 Corsairs were completed. The U.S. Navy's own carrier reluctance took until nearly the end of the war to fully dissolve. Although a Corsair had managed a single experimental carrier landing as early as 25 September 1942, the Navy did not begin sustained carrier operations with the type until late 1944, and the first Marine Corps Air Group to be permanently assigned a carrier, MASG-48, aboard USS Block Island, didn't take that assignment until 4 February 1945, 5 months before the war's end, and more than 2 years after the Corsair had already been fighting from land runways in the Solomons and Rabaul. Production continued from 1942 to 1953, the longest run of any American piston-engined fighter, with total output across all variants exceeding 12,500 airframes, a figure that, on its own, says something about how thoroughly the Navy's early carrier rejection failed to slow the aircraft down in the long run. The Corsair went on to fight a second war in Korea, flying primarily in the close support role the Marines had already proven over Guadalcanal and Okinawa, dropping napalm and rockets against dug-in positions the jet-powered aircraft of the era were often too fast to attack accurately at low level. Navy pilot Guy Bordelon became the only American propeller-driven ace of that conflict, flying an F-4U 5N night fighter variant. And in 1952, a Corsair reportedly downed a communist jet fighter, a MiG-15, by most accounts, though the engagement details remain disputed. In one of the rare instances anywhere of a piston-engine aircraft killing a jet in air-to-air combat. The type's last confirmed combat use came in 1969, during the brief Honduras-El Salvador conflict sometimes called the Soccer War, nearly 3 decades after Rex Basil first sketched the bend in that wing, and roughly a quarter of a century after the last wartime F-4U-1D dropped its last bomb over the Pacific. None of the men in that 1938 design meeting became famous for it. Rex Basel kept working as a Vought chief engineer through the following decade, eventually contributing to the early jet age F-7U cut list before his death in 1974 at the age of 81. No plaque marks the meeting room, and no popular account of the Corsair leads with his name the way it leads with Boynton's or Lindbergh's. Alfred Sabila's own account of the moment, Basil simply asking, mid-discussion, why they didn't put a bend in the wing where the gear attached, surfaced publicly only in a February 1995 magazine article, more than half a century after the fact, because someone finally thought to sit down and ask him what he remembered. For the most of the intervening decades, the story the public got was the shape itself, an unmistakable silhouette, explained in most accounts as pure aerodynamic genius, with no mention of the mundane undercarriage arithmetic that actually produced it, and no mention that the man who solved it wasn't reaching for a novel idea at all. He was trying to avoid building landing gear tall enough to embarrass itself on a carrier deck. There's no dramatic reversal here, no committee overruled at the last minute, no Maverick vindicated in a climactic test flight over the objections of his superiors. Basil was the superior in that room, and the fix he proposed was, by his own team's later account, almost too obvious to feel like an invention when he said it. What makes the Corsair story worth telling isn't a lone genius defying the establishment, it's the reverse. The established, credentialed, thoroughly conventional engineer got there by refusing to accept a straight-wing layout that technically met every specification on paper, but would have handed the Navy an undercarriage problem it couldn't afford. The bend that solved it became the most recognizable silhouette to come out of the Pacific War, fought first by Marines who weren't supposed to have it on carriers at all, adopted for deck operations by an Allied Navy before its own home service admitted the aircraft was ready, flown to a war record disputed in its precise numbers but never in its basic shape, and still turning heads at air shows 80 years later on the same airframe logic worked out on a drawing board in East Hartford, Connecticut, over a problem nobody wanted to be the one still stuck on. Sometimes the fix for a hard problem isn't a new idea. It's the plainest possible restatements of the old one said out loud by the one person in the room willing to ask something that sounded too simple to matter.
Operational use of these ridiculous rubber contraptions was concentrated in a series of deceptions codenamed Operation Bertram, but the earlier, more spontaneous use in the summer of 1941 is where the panic truly set in. The location was the very scene our German pilots stumbled upon, the approaches to Salem and Halfaya Pass. The specific operation involved the 1st Battalion, Durham Light Infantry, working alongside a small detachment of camouflage engineers. They were tasked with holding a section of the front that was, in reality, held together by little more than baling wire and bravado. They erected a full dummy armored regiment. Tanks were inflated in the wadis, visible only from the air. Fake radio traffic was generated between non-existent tank commanders, filling the German intercept frequencies with chatter about petrol shortages and track maintenance. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. The German pilot's report of grosse Gummipanzer was initially treated with skepticism by intelligence officers, but the photographs from the reconnaissance flight were undeniable. They showed a concentration of heavy armor in a location where German intelligence had assessed the British were weak. The interpretation in Rommel's headquarters was not, "those are fakes." The interpretation was, "British reinforcement convoys are arriving faster than we anticipated. They are hiding their strength." This was the critical error. The Germans, who prided themselves on their technical superiority and thoroughness, could not conceive of an enemy deploying a full brigade of children's party novelties as a strategic weapon. The very absurdity of the concept was its greatest shield. Rommel, ever cautious about outrunning his supply lines, paused his advance to reassess the threat posed by this phantom armored division. That pause, measured in just 48 to 72 hours, was worth more than a real tank regiment. It bought time for the actual British armor to regroup and reinforce the defensive line at Mersa Matruh. It is important to be honest about what is documented versus what is speculated. We know for certain that the dummy tanks were deployed at Salem. We have the aerial photographs, both German and British, that show the eerie geometry of the inflatable formations. We have the after-action reports from the camouflage units describing the near-constant patching of bullet holes, strafing Messerschmitts often aimed at the tanks, and the canvas crews would have to scramble out at night with rubber solution to fix the leaks before the morning sun made the structure sag like a failed soufflé. What is sparser is the exact German reaction in real-time signals intelligence. Enigma decrypts from the period do not feature a line reading Panzer sind Luftballons, but the operational pause is a matter of historical record. Rommel's war diary shows a period of re-evaluation in mid-May 1941 attributed to unexpected enemy armored concentrations in the coastal sector. The rubber tanks had done their job. When we compare this British innovation to the efforts of the other combatants, the contrast is stark. The Germans did eventually attempt similar ruses. During the preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, they constructed dummy wooden aircraft on French airfields and mocked up invasion barges in the channel ports. However, German deception was largely static and defensive. It was designed to hide what they were doing or to exaggerate the strength of a fixed position. The Americans, entering the war later, established their own deception units, most notably the Ghost Army of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops in the European theater. The American effort was vast, sophisticated, and involved inflatable Sherman tanks that were, in some respects, even more detailed than the British equivalents. They even used massive loudspeakers to broadcast the sound of tank columns moving at night. But the British effort in the desert was unique in its agility and its sheer psychological audacity. The American inflatable Sherman weighed in at around 42 kilograms and required a slightly larger crew to erect. The British Crusader dummy at 50 kilograms was more robust to desert winds. The key difference was the strategic context. The American Ghost Army was used to deceive an enemy that was already retreating. The British rubber tanks of 1941 were deployed to stave off a catastrophic defeat against a superior, aggressive foe. The British version was superior not necessarily in the stitching of the canvas, but in the desperate, eccentric ingenuity of the moment. It was a theatrical response to a mechanical problem, and it's a concept that was widely copied, though rarely admitted, by every major army in the decades that followed. The actual historical impact of these inflatable brigades extends far beyond a few punctured seams and panicked reconnaissance pilots. It lies in the realm of what military theorists call information warfare. The rubber tank proved that war is not just a contest of steel and firepower, but a contest of perception. If you can control what the enemy believes to be true, you can control his decisions. The cost-benefit analysis is staggering to consider. A real Crusader tank in 1941 cost the British taxpayer approximately £13,000 and required a crew of 5 men and a logistical tail of spare parts stretching back to the Midlands. A dummy tank cost about £180 and required a lance corporal with a bicycle pump and a pot of glue. In terms of effect, that £180 bought a 48-hour delay in the enemy's operational tempo. It's almost impossible to quantify the lives saved by that delay, but the military accountants at the War Office certainly realized they had stumbled upon one of the greatest force multipliers in history. The legacy of the desert dummies is writ large in the planning of the D-Day landings. The elaborate deception plan known as forcing fortitude, which convinced Hitler that the invasion would come at Calais rather than Normandy, was a direct descendant of the lessons learned with inflatable tanks outside Salem. The fake radio traffic, the dummy landing craft, the entirely fictitious 1st United States Army Group commanded by General Patton, all of it was the desert deception writ large upon the green fields of England. The psychological effect was no longer just a pause in a local advance. It was the immobilization of 19 German divisions in the Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that existed only in their heads and in a few thousand feet of classified reconnaissance film. Today, surviving examples of these rubber warriors are vanishingly rare. The very nature of their construction meant they were temporary things. They were deflated, packed away, or simply rotted under the desert sun once their moment of glory had passed.
A few fragments of wooden artillery and remnants of canvas covers exist in regimental museums in Britain, often tucked away in a dusty corner, overshadowed by the gleaming, oily reality of the actual tanks that won the war. But if you know what you're looking for, you can still see the evidence. In the archives at the Imperial War Museum, there's a grainy black and white film reel. It shows a group of grinning Tommies in khaki shorts, looking less like soldiers and more like a touring circus crew. With a theatrical flourish, one of them throws a switch. There's a hissing sound like the world's largest whoopee cushion, and within seconds, a Crusader tank rises from the sand. It sways slightly in the breeze, a giant made of nothing but hot air and hope. Let us return for a moment to that ridge near Sollum. The sun is setting now, casting long, distorted shadows from the inflatable tanks across the stony ground. The German reconnaissance plane is long gone, back to base with its fantastical tail. The men of the Durham Light Infantry are brewing tea behind a rock, careful to keep the glow of the Primo stove hidden. They are tired, thirsty, and fully aware that if a real Panzer division crests that rise, their canvas fleet will provide precisely zero protection against an armor-piercing shell. Yet they are quietly, grimly satisfied. They know what they have achieved. They have fought the battle not with armor plate, but with imagination. This was the ridiculous rubber tank Britain deployed. It was a contraption that should not have worked. It was a weapon that defied every convention of military engineering. It was a bluff of such monumental cheek that it forced the German High Command to question the evidence of their own eyes. In a war defined by the thunder of heavy artillery and the scream of Stuka dive bombers, these silent, inflatable phantoms held the line. They were a testament to the fact that in the brutal, unforgiving arithmetic of war, sometimes the most effective weapon is not the heaviest, but the most clever. And while the steel tanks of El Alamein and Normandy have long since rusted away, the memory of these ridiculous rubber impostors endures, bobbing gently in the wind of history, a perfect monument to the day Britain won a battle with nothing more than a canvas lie and a bicycle pump. They were hollow, but their effect was profoundly, strategically real.
The 15th of May, 1941. The sun has barely cleared the crest of the desert escarpment near Sollum, on the border between Egypt and Libya. The air is still cool, but it carries that dry, metallic promise of blistering heat to come. A German reconnaissance pilot, flying a Fieseler Storch at just a few hundred meters, squints through the haze. Below him, the landscape is a shattered palette of ochre and bone white, a place where the horizon dances in the shimmer of a heat mirage. He is looking for movement, for the telltale dust plumes of the British 8th Army, or perhaps the silhouette of a Matilda infantry tank lumbering across the hard-packed sand. And then he sees them, a full squadron. He blinks, wiping the perspiration from his goggles. It is a formation of vehicles, but they are unlike anything he has ever witnessed in the manuals back at base. They are monstrous in scale, yet they float. There is no other word for it. They glide across the desert floor with an eerie bobbing motion, their turrets enormous and bulbous, like the heads of prehistoric beasts. The pilot's stomach clenches. This is not a trick of the light. He banks the Storch sharply, the engine straining as he circles for a better look. He counts 10, maybe 12 of them, all moving in a coordinated line towards the Axis positions at Halfaya Pass. The radio crackles in his headset. He presses the transmit button, his voice tight with the shock of discovery. Achtung, Panzer, schwere Panzer. He hesitates, searching for the right word. Große Gummipanzer. Big rubber tanks. What the pilot is witnessing is not a hallucination brought on by the desert sun. It is, in fact, one of the most audacious and utterly ridiculous deceptions of the Second World War. And it is about to work far better than anyone in Whitehall drawing office ever dared to imagine.
This is the story of how the British Army went to war with a fleet of inflatable lorries, dummy artillery, and a brigade of tanks made from little more than canvas and a very great deal of hot air. It is a story of camouflage elevated to a fine art, of psychology wielded as a weapon, and of a lie so convincing that it sent the German High Command into a spiral of panic that would ultimately help turn the tide of the war. The problem that necessitated this bouncy castle approach to warfare was not one of rubber supply or industrial laziness. It was a problem of mathematics, and the mathematics were brutal. By the spring of 1941, the British Empire stood largely alone against the German war machine. In the western desert of North Africa, the stakes could not have been higher. This was not a sideshow. Control of Egypt meant control of the Suez Canal, the jugular vein of the empire's oil supply and communication with India and the Far East. Lose Egypt, and the strategic consequences were almost unthinkable. The adversary was the Deutsches Afrika Korps, commanded by a man whose name had already become synonymous with tactical brilliance, General Erwin Rommel. The Desert Fox had arrived in February with orders to prop up the collapsing Italian forces, and he had done so with a ferocious velocity that left the British command reeling. Rommel possessed a relatively small but highly professional and well-equipped force of Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks. The British, by contrast, were stretched thinner than the canvas on their own dummy tanks. They were fighting a global war, with resources and men being poured into the Atlantic convoys, the defense of the home islands against invasion, and the burgeoning threat in the Far East. In the desert, the maths were depressingly simple. Rommel's panzer divisions were designed for rapid, concentrated thrusts. The British could not match his numbers of actual operational tanks. Worse still, they could not match the quality. The standard British cruiser tanks of the period, such as the A9 and A10, were notoriously unreliable, their tracks shedding pins on the hard desert going as readily as a snake sheds its skin. Their main armament, the 2-pounder gun, fired a solid shot that was perfectly adequate for punching holes, but useless against the German 88M guns, which Rommel was using with devastating effect as anti-tank weapons. The failure of existing solutions lay in the art of reconnaissance. Rommel relied heavily on aerial photography and signals intelligence to build a picture of the British order of battle. He needed to know where the 7th Armored Division, the famed Desert Rats, were concentrating their strength. If the Germans saw a gap in the British lines, an undefended wadi or a flank guarded only by a thin screen of infantry, they would pour through it like water through a cracked dam. The British Army needed to create strength where none existed. They needed to make the desert seem crowded with armor, when in reality their workshops were empty and their reinforcements were 2 months away at the bottom of the Atlantic or rounding the Cape of Good Hope. The challenge felt impossible. How do you conjure a heavy armored brigade out of thin air? The solution would not come from a factory floor in Birmingham or a shipyard on the Clyde. It would come from a film studio. Specifically, it came from the ingenious minds gathered at the Camouflage Development and Training Center at Farnham Castle in Surrey, and later refined by a specialist unit given the deliberately dull bureaucratic title of A-Force. The man who would become synonymous with this grand illusion was a stage designer and magician named Jasper Maskelyne. While the popular history overstates Maskelyne's role as a lone conjurer, he was undoubtedly a vital cog in a wider military machine that realized deception was not about hiding, but about showing the enemy exactly what you wanted them to see. The technical innovation they perfected was the dummy tank, and the primary material was rubberized canvas. The process was deceptively simple in theory and exhausting in practice. The tank was not a balloon shaped like a vehicle. It was a collapsible skeleton, usually made of a dozen or so thin steel tubes and tension wires, much like the frame of a modern festival tent. Over this frame, a carefully tailored envelope of painted rubberized canvas was stretched and secured. The canvas was painted in the standard British camouflage colors of the period, the pale stone and dark green of the counter scheme, named after its designer. The engineering was far more precise than one might expect for an inflatable weapon. The dimensions of a dummy Crusader tank had to be exact. A German reconnaissance photo analyst in Rome or Berlin would be looking for specific telltale signs. The width was precisely 2.7 meters. The length, including the dummy barrel of the 2-pounder gun, was just shy of 6 meters. Critically, the weight was a little under 50 kilograms when packed, meaning 4 men could carry the entire vehicle in 2 canvas haldalls and erect it in under 20 minutes. Compare that to the 14 tons of a real Crusader. A small compressor, powered by a petrol generator or even a hand pump in a pinch, would inflate the structure. The rubberized fabric was treated to prevent the glare of the sun from causing a reflection that might differ from the matte steel of a real hull. To complete the illusion, the men of the camouflage units would use jerry cans of water to create artificial tank tracks in the sand leading up to the dummy vehicle, and they would even place a small pan of burning petrol and diesel mix nearby at dusk to simulate the heat signature of a recently running engine for any inquisitive aircraft with infrared detection, a nascent but feared technology at the time. The manufacturing of these ghost tanks was scattered across the country, largely shielded from the Luftwaffe's bombs. The primary contractor was the RFD Company in Surrey, a firm that had previously specialized in barrage balloons and life rafts. They produced hundreds of these inflatable deceptions. By the middle of 1941, the production line was churning out not just tanks. There were inflatable 3-ton lorries, their canopies sagging just so. There were dummy artillery pieces, their long barrels pointing menacingly at the sky, made from drain pipes and wood. Exact production numbers for the North African campaign remain elusive due to the clandestine nature of the work. Official records from A-Force were often destroyed to maintain secrecy. But estimates suggest that by the time of the Second Battle of El Alamein, well over 1,000 individual dummy vehicles and equipment pieces had been deployed across the theater.